What if I told you that every single aspect of modern civilization, from the wheel you drive on to the laws that govern you, from the writing system you're reading right now to the very concept of cities themselves, all originated in one place over 5,000 years ago? Welcome to Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where humanity took its first giant leap from scattered tribes to organized empires. But here's what most people don't know. This wasn't just the birthplace of civilization. It was also home to the world's first war, the first code of laws, and even the first recipe for beer. Today, we're diving into the complete 3,000-year saga of the land between two rivers, and I guarantee you'll never look at human history the same way again. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The cradle of civilization. Picture the universe as it was, billions of years ago. Stars scattered like distant candles across endless darkness. Our sun, just another flickering light in space, slowly warming a small blue planet. Earth spins quietly through the void, oceans rising and falling with the pull of the moon. Time moves forward, patient and steady. Mountains push up from the ground. Rivers carve their paths through stone and soil. Rain falls. Seasons change. Life begins in the water, then crawls onto land, then learns to walk upright. Now zoom closer. Focus on one small corner of our world. Here, between two great rivers, something special is about to happen. Something that has never happened before in all of Earth's long history. The land lies quiet under morning sun. No cities rise from the horizon. No roads cut through the grass, no voices call across the fields, just earth and water and sky, waiting. But change is coming. In this peaceful place, humans will do something extraordinary. They will stop wandering. They will plant seeds, they will build walls, they will create the first cities, the first kings, the first written words. This is Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, the place where civilization begins. Look around this ancient world. The Tigris flows from the north, carrying snowmelt from distant mountains. The Euphrates runs beside it, slightly to the west. Between them stretches a valley of rich, dark soil. When the rivers flood each spring, they leave behind layers of mud thick with nutrients, perfect for growing food. The first people who settle here understand something important. If you can control water, you can control life. If you can make the desert bloom, you can feed many mouths. If you can feed many people, you can build something lasting. But this gift comes with a price. The floods arrive when they choose, not when humans want them. Some years bring too much water, some bring too little. The land gives life, then takes it away. Those who live here must learn to work together or they will not survive. In the beginning, there are no maps of this place. No names for the rivers or the cities that will rise beside them, just endless possibilities stretching toward the horizon. The stage is set. The actors are about to enter. The greatest story in human history is about to begin. Here, in this quiet valley, everything changes. Writing, law, empire, religion, mathematics, astronomy, all of it starts here, in the land between two rivers. The cradle rocks gently, and civilization takes its first breath. Geography and the power of the rivers. The Tigris runs fast and wild, cutting deep channels through the earth. Its waters carry the strength of mountain storms, rushing toward the sea with urgent purpose. The river changes course when it pleases, leaving behind oxbow lakes and fertile marshes where fish swim in the shallows. The Euphrates moves more slowly, winding through the landscape like a lazy snake in summer sun. Its waters run clear and calm, perfect for drinking and washing. Small boats drift downstream, carrying grain and pottery between the growing settlements. Between these two rivers lies the heart of Mesopotamia. The soil here is dark and thick, rich with thousands of years of river mud. When you dig into this earth, it feels almost alive in your hands. Plants grow tall and strong. Wheat waves golden in the fields. Barley fills the granaries. Date palms offer sweet fruit and cooling shade. But step away from the rivers and everything changes. The desert begins just beyond the green belt of farms. Sand stretches endlessly under the burning sun. No trees offer shelter. No streams provide water. Survival here requires knowledge, planning, and luck. This contrast shapes everything about life in ancient Mesopotamia. The rivers give life, but they also give death. When the floods come too early, they wash away villages and drown the crops. When they come too late, the fields turn to dust and people starve. The people learn to read the sky for signs of rain. They watch the river levels rise and fall with the seasons. Spring brings the great floods, fed by melting snow in the mountains far to the north. Summer means hot, dry months when every drop of water becomes precious. Autumn offers a brief time of cooling temperatures. Winter brings enough rain to keep hope alive until the next spring flood. Those who master these rhythms thrive. Those who ignore them disappear into the desert, their bones bleaching white under the endless sun. The land teaches hard lessons, but it also rewards those who listen. Here, geography becomes destiny. The rivers determine where cities can grow. The desert decides which routes traders can follow. The floods set the calendar for planting and harvest. Even the gods themselves seem to follow the patterns of water and earth, blessing the fields when the rivers rise at just the right time. This is not easy country. It demands respect. It requires cooperation. Individual families cannot dig the irrigation channels needed to bring water to distant fields. Single villages cannot build the dikes necessary to control the spring floods. Success here means working together, pooling knowledge and labor, accepting that some must lead while others follow. The land between the rivers creates its own kind of people. Hardy, practical, deeply aware that their survival depends on understanding the natural world around them. They become engineers out of necessity, mathematicians because they must measure water and grain, astronomers because they need to predict the floods. Geography writes the first chapter of their story. Everything that follows grows from this simple truth. In Mesopotamia, water is life, and life requires cooperation. The first settlements, Eridu and Ubaid culture. Picture a small group of families walking across the marsh. Their feet sink into soft mud with each step. Reed birds call from hidden nests. Fish jump in the shallow pools. The air smells of water and growing things. These people have been wandering for generations, following herds of wild animals, gathering seeds and roots wherever they can find them. But something has changed. The women carry seeds in carefully woven baskets. The men drag simple plows made from tree branches. Children help tend small flocks of sheep and goats. They are looking for a place to stop, a place to stay. They find it here, on a small rise of land overlooking the marshes. The spot offers everything they need: fresh water from the river, fish swimming in the channels, wild birds nesting in the reeds, rich soil for planting crops, clay for making pots and bricks. This is Eridu, though it doesn't have a name yet. Just a handful of reed huts beside the water. The beginning of something unprecedented. The first houses are simple, bundles of reeds tied together, bent into arches, covered with mats woven from marsh grass. The floors are packed earth, the roofs leak when it rains, but these humble shelters mark a revolution in human life. For the first time, people choose to stay in one place year after year. They plant seeds and wait for them to grow. They build storage pits for grain. They make pottery to hold water and food. They create the first permanent settlement in human history. The early years are hard. Crops fail. Floods destroy the village. Disease strikes the animals. Some families give up and return to wandering. But others stay, learning from each mistake, building their knowledge generation by generation. Slowly, the settlement grows. More families arrive, drawn by stories of successful harvests. The houses become larger and more solid. Instead of reed huts, people begin building with mud bricks dried in the sun. The village spreads along the riverbank. With permanent settlement comes new kinds of work. Some people specialize in making pottery. Others become expert at weaving baskets and mats. A few show skill at working metal, shaping copper into tools and ornaments. Division of labor begins. The most important building in the village is not a house at all. It is a temple built on the highest ground, facing the rising sun. Here, the people gather to honor the gods who control the floods and the harvests. The temple grows larger with each generation, becoming the heart of community life. This is the Ubaid culture, named by modern scholars after the site where archaeologists first discovered its remains. It spreads slowly across southern Mesopotamia, village by village, family by family, the same pottery styles, the same house designs, the same religious practices. Life follows the rhythm of the seasons. Spring brings planting time when everyone works in the fields from dawn to dusk. Summer means tending the growing crops and preparing for harvest. Autumn brings the gathering of grain and the celebration of successful crops. Winter offers time for crafts and storytelling around the fire. The dead are buried beneath the floors of houses, staying close to the living. Children play with toy animals made from clay. Women grind grain on stone querns. Men fish in the marshes and hunt wild birds. Old people tell stories of the wandering times, when homes were carried on backs and the horizon always called. Nobody knows they are making history. They are simply trying to survive, to feed their families, to make life a little easier than it was for their parents. But in these small, quiet villages, something extraordinary is happening. Humans are learning to live together in permanent communities. They are creating surplus food. They are developing new technologies. They are laying the foundation for everything that will follow. The seeds of civilization are planted in Ubaid's soil. Soon, they will grow into something the world has never seen before. The rise of Sumer, birth of the city-states. The villages are growing. What began as small clusters of mud brick houses beside the rivers has become something larger. The temples rise higher, the walls grow thicker, the fields stretch further from the settlement centers. People are learning new things. How to make bronze by mixing copper and tin. How to shape clay on a spinning wheel. How to brew beer from barley. How to write simple marks on clay tablets to keep track of grain and livestock. But the greatest change is in how people organize themselves. The old ways, where everyone knows everyone else, no longer work when thousands of people live together. New forms of leadership emerge. New social rules develop. The city-state is born. Uruk leads the way. Built on an island in the marsh, protected by water and walls, it grows larger than any human settlement before it. At its heart stands a massive temple complex, the precursor to all the great ziggurats that will follow. The city spreads outward in rings, with neighborhoods for different crafts and trades. The ruler of Uruk is both king and high priest. He speaks for the gods and leads the army. His palace sits beside the temple, and his word is law throughout the city and its surrounding farmland. Power has become centralized in ways that earlier village leaders could never have imagined. Other cities follow Uruk's example. Rises from the mud of the southern marshes, its people becoming master traders and skilled metalworkers. Lagash builds its walls strong and high, preparing for the wars that everyone knows are coming. Kish claims to be the first city to receive kingship from heaven. Each city-state is a world unto itself. Each has its own patron god, its own king, its own laws and traditions. The god of Uruk is Anu, lord of heaven. The god of Ur is Nana, the moon. The god of Lagash is Ningirsu, warrior and protector. The cities compete with each other for everything: water rights, trade routes, fertile land, religious authority. What begins as rivalry soon becomes warfare. The first armies march across Mesopotamia carrying bronze weapons and protected by leather armor. Kings build palaces to display their power. Craftsmen create beautiful objects to honor the gods and impress foreign visitors. Merchants establish trade networks that stretch from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Turkey. Farmers develop new techniques for irrigation and crop rotation. The city-states develop their own personalities. Uruk becomes known for its great literature and religious festivals. Masters the arts of metalworking and long-distance trade. Lagash produces fierce warriors and skilled engineers. Kish becomes a center of royal power and political intrigue. In each city, social classes become more distinct. At the top sit the king and the high priests, living in luxury and commanding the labor of thousands. Below them are the nobles and wealthy merchants, owning land and slaves. In the middle are the skilled craftsmen and traders, free but not powerful. At the bottom are the farmers and laborers, barely above slavery. The temple remains the center of economic life. It owns vast amounts of land. It employs hundreds of workers. It stores grain and goods from across the known world. It lends money and settles disputes. It is bank, warehouse, court, and spiritual center all in one. Women in these early cities can own property and run businesses. Some become priestesses with real power. Others work as merchants or craft specialists. But as the city-states grow more complex and more warlike, women's roles become more restricted. Children of the wealthy learn to read and write at temple schools. They study mathematics and astronomy. They memorize religious texts and epic poems. Education becomes a path to power and prestige. The Sumerian city-states create the template for urban civilization. Their innovations in government, religion, technology, and social organization will influence every civilization that follows. They are inventing the future, one mud brick at a time. But success brings new problems. The cities grow too large for their food supplies. Conflicts over water and land become more serious. Warfare becomes more deadly and more frequent. The golden age of early Sumer is about to face its first great test: Sumerian religion and the ziggurat temples. The gods are everywhere in Sumer. They control the floods that bring life or destruction. They decide which crops will grow and which will fail. They choose which cities will prosper and which will fall to their enemies. They are powerful, unpredictable, and absolutely essential to understand. But Sumerian gods are not distant, perfect beings. They are remarkably human in their emotions and desires. They feel anger, jealousy, love, and fear. They make mistakes. They change their minds. They fight among themselves and play favorites with mortals. They are, in many ways, like very powerful people with very bad tempers. Anu rules the heavens from his throne in Uruk. Enlil commands the wind and storm from his temple in Nippur. Enki controls the fresh water that flows through the rivers and springs. Inanna governs love and war, bringing both passion and destruction to mortals. Each god has a particular city where they are most honored. Each city has a patron deity who protects it and receives special worship. The relationship between god and city is like a contract. The people provide offerings, build temples, and perform rituals. In return, the god grants protection, fertility, and prosperity. The most impressive religious buildings are the ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids that rise from the heart of each city. These are not tombs like the Egyptian pyramids. They are artificial mountains built to bring humans closer to the realm of the gods. Construction of a ziggurat takes generations. Thousands of workers carry millions of mud bricks to the building site. Each brick is made by hand, dried in the sun, and carefully placed by skilled masons. The structure grows slowly, level by level, until it towers over the surrounding city. At the top of each ziggurat sits a small temple, the most sacred space in the city. Only the highest priests can enter this holy place, where they perform rituals that affect the welfare of everyone below. The god is thought to descend from heaven to receive offerings and communicate with mortals. The base of the ziggurat contains many rooms. Some are workshops where artisans create objects for religious ceremonies. Others are storage areas for grain, oil, and precious goods. Still others serve as living quarters for the priests and temple workers. Temple life follows a precise schedule. Dawn brings the first prayers and offerings. Midday sees the presentation of food to the god's statue. Evening brings more prayers and the closing of the temple doors. The same rituals are performed day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The priests are powerful figures in Sumerian society. They control vast wealth. They influence political decisions. They educate the children of the elite. They keep the calendars that determine when to plant and harvest. They are doctors, teachers, astronomers, and economists all at once. Religious festivals mark the turning of the seasons and celebrate important events in the myths of the gods. During these celebrations, the normal order of society is suspended. Masters serve their slaves, men dress as women. Sacred dramas reenact the stories of creation and renewal. The Sumerians believed that humans were created to serve the gods. This is not seen as a burden, but as an honor. By building temples, offering sacrifices, and performing rituals correctly, mortals participate in maintaining the cosmic order. Their work has divine purpose. Death is not feared as much as meaninglessness. The afterlife is a shadowy realm where spirits exist but do not truly live. The way to achieve immortality is through great deeds that will be remembered in songs and stories. Glory matters more than individual survival. The relationship between gods and mortals is complex. The gods need humans to provide them with food, shelter, and worship. Humans need the gods to provide them with protection, fertility, and meaning. It is a partnership, though clearly not one between equals. This religious system creates social stability. Everyone knows their place in the cosmic order. Everyone understands their duties to the gods and to their community. Everyone shares in the same basic beliefs about how the universe works and what life means. But it also creates tension. The gods are unpredictable. Disasters can strike without warning. Good people suffer while evil ones prosper. The priests claim to speak for the gods, but how can anyone be certain they are telling the truth? These tensions will shape Sumerian culture for centuries to come. They will inspire the world's first great literature. They will drive the development of science and philosophy. They will challenge kings and comfort commoners. The gods of Sumer are creating more than just religion. They are creating the human struggle to understand existence itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the First Kings. Long ago, in the city of Uruk, there lived a king unlike any other. His name was Gilgamesh, and he was 2 parts god and 1 part human. He stood taller than other men. His strength could break bronze weapons. His voice could be heard from one end of the city to the other. But Gilgamesh was not a good king. He took whatever he wanted. He forced young men to work on his building projects until they collapsed from exhaustion. He claimed the right to sleep with any bride on her wedding night. The people of Uruk groaned under his rule and prayed to the gods for relief. The gods heard their prayers and created Enkidu, a wild man who lived with the animals in the forest. Enkidu had never seen a city or spoken to humans. He was covered with hair like a beast and knew nothing of civilization. But he was strong enough to match Gilgamesh in battle. When Gilgamesh heard about this wild man, he sent a temple woman to civilize Enkidu. She taught him to eat bread, drink beer, and wear clothes. She showed him the ways of human society. When Enkidu learned how Gilgamesh oppressed his people, he became angry and went to challenge the king. The 2 heroes fought in the streets of Uruk. They wrestled like bulls, crashing through walls and shaking the ground with their struggle. Neither could defeat the other. In their mutual respect, they became the closest of friends. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu performed great deeds. They traveled to the cedar forest and killed Humbaba, the terrible monster who guarded the trees. They defeated the bull of heaven that the goddess Ishtar sent to destroy Uruk. They became famous throughout the world, but the gods grew angry at their defiance. As punishment, they decreed that Enkidu must die. Gilgamesh watched helplessly as his friends sickened and died. For the first time in his life, the great king felt the full weight of grief and loss. Enkidu's death awakened in Gilgamesh a terrible fear of his own mortality. If someone as strong and brave as Enkidu could die, then surely he too would face the same fate. He abandoned his kingdom and wandered the world, searching for the secret of eternal life. His quest led him to Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood. This ancient man told Gilgamesh the secret of immortality, a plant that grew at the bottom of the sea. The king dove deep into the waters and retrieved the magical plant, but on his journey home, a serpent stole it while he slept. Gilgamesh returned to Uruk empty-handed but wiser. He had learned that immortality belongs to the gods alone. Mortals must find meaning in their brief lives through great deeds, lasting love, and the cities they build. He became a better king, ruling with wisdom and compassion until his natural death. This story was told and retold throughout Mesopotamia for thousands of years. Bards sang it in palace halls. Priests recited it in temples. Mothers whispered it to their children. It became the world's first great work of literature, exploring themes that still resonate today. The historical Gilgamesh probably lived around 2700 BCE. He was indeed a king of Uruk, though not the superhuman figure of legend. Like other early rulers, he combined religious authority with political power. He was priest-king, war leader, and judge all in one. These first kings of Sumer established patterns of rulership that would last for millennia. They claimed divine approval for their authority. They built great monuments to display their power. They led armies in battle and presided over religious ceremonies. They created the institution of kingship itself. The king's palace was second only to the temple in importance. Here, royal officials collected taxes, settled disputes, and planned military campaigns. Scribes kept records of everything that happened in the kingdom. Craftsmen created beautiful objects to honor the royal family. Royal power was not absolute in early Sumer. Kings had to work with councils of elders and assembly of citizens. In times of crisis, especially war, royal authority increased. In times of peace, it was more limited. The balance between royal power and popular participation remained fluid. Kings were buried with great ceremony, sometimes accompanied by servants and soldiers who chose to die with their master. These royal tombs, discovered by archaeologists, reveal the wealth and power of Sumerian rulers. Gold, silver, precious stones, and beautiful artifacts accompanied the dead into the afterlife. The Epic of Gilgamesh captures the complexity of early Sumerian kingship. Kings were powerful but not all-powerful. They were human but claimed divine favor. They could accomplish great things but were ultimately mortal. The story reminds us that even the mightiest rulers must face the limits of human existence. In telling this tale, the Sumerians created something new in human culture: the literary exploration of what it means to be human in a world controlled by gods and governed by kings. Sumerian warfare and the age of conflicts. The peaceful days of early farming villages are ending. Across Sumer, cities grow larger and more powerful. Their walls rise higher. Their armies march farther from home. Competition for water, land, and trade routes turns neighbors into enemies. War in early Sumer is not yet the organized destruction it will become. Armies are small, usually made up of farmers and craftsmen who put down their tools to pick up weapons when their city is threatened. They fight with copper-tipped spears, simple axes, and wooden clubs. Leather shields provide protection. Victory often goes to the side with more men rather than better equipment. The first battles are fought over practical matters. One city blocks another's access to river water. A trade route is disputed. Boundary stones are moved in the night. Raiders from the desert attack farming settlements. These conflicts start small but quickly escalate as honor and pride become involved. Kings discover that successful warfare brings great rewards. Defeated enemies provide slaves to work the fields and build monuments. Captured cities yield tribute of grain, livestock, and precious goods. Victory in battle proves divine favor and strengthens the king's authority at home. The Sumerians develop new military technologies. Bronze weapons are harder and sharper than copper ones. Horse-drawn chariots allow rapid movement across the battlefield. Siege engines can break down city walls. Professional soldiers replace farmer warriors. The earliest Sumerian armies fight in loose formation, each warrior fighting as an individual, but gradually they learn the power of coordinated action. The phalanx formation, with soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder behind a wall of shields and spears, becomes devastatingly effective against traditional fighting methods. Fortifications grow more sophisticated as warfare intensifies. Cities build multiple walls with towers and gates. Moats filled with water protect the approaches. Storage areas inside the walls can feed the population during long sieges. Some cities become nearly impregnable fortresses. The most famous early conflict is the war between Lagash and Umma over the fertile Gu Eden field. This struggle continues for generations, with each city claiming divine support for its position. Boundary stones are erected, destroyed, and rebuilt. Kings issue proclamations justifying their actions. The gods themselves are said to take sides. As warfare becomes more common, military leaders gain political power. Successful generals are chosen as kings. Royal families intermarry to create military alliances. Cities that cannot defend themselves become vassals to stronger neighbors. The political map of Sumer begins to change. The human cost of constant warfare is enormous. Young men die in battle instead of working in the fields. Families are broken apart when fathers and sons march off to war. Refugees from destroyed cities wander the countryside, spreading disease and hunger. Trade routes become dangerous, disrupting the economy. Warfare also drives technological and social innovation. Cities must become more efficient to support their armies. New forms of organization emerge to coordinate military campaigns. Communication systems improve to carry messages between allies. The demands of war accelerate the pace of change. Religious justification for warfare becomes increasingly important. Kings claim that their wars are commanded by the gods. Priests perform rituals before battle to ensure divine favor. Victory is seen as proof that the gods approve. Defeat means the gods are angry and must be appeased. The psychology of warfare changes Sumerian society. Heroic values become more important than peaceful ones. Young men dream of glory in battle rather than success in farming or crafts. Women learn to defend their homes when the men are away fighting. Children grow up hearing stories of famous battles and legendary warriors. Some Sumerian cities try to avoid the escalating violence. They focus on trade rather than conquest. They build diplomatic relationships with their neighbors. They hire mercenaries rather than raising their own armies. But in the long run, these peaceful cities often fall to more aggressive neighbors. The Age of Conflicts transforms Sumer from a collection of independent farming communities into a militarized society where power comes from the ability to wage war. This transformation will shape Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years to come. The stage is set for the rise of the first true empire. Soon, a leader will emerge who can unite the warring cities under a single rule. The Age of Conquest is about to begin. The invention of writing. Cuneiform changes everything. Picture a Sumerian merchant sitting in his storehouse, surrounded by jars of oil, baskets of grain, and bundles of wool. He has traded with dozens of people this month. Some have paid him, others still owe him goods. Some have promised to deliver animals next season. Others have borrowed grain to plant their fields. How can he remember all these transactions? How can he prove what people owe him? How can he plan for the future when he cannot keep track of the past? The solution comes slowly, almost by accident. The merchant begins making small marks on clay tablets, a wedge for a sheep, a circle for a jar of oil, simple pictures that help him remember. At first, these marks are just memory aids, meaningless to anyone else, but gradually, something extraordinary happens. The pictures become symbols. The symbols begin to represent not just things, but sounds. The sounds combine to form words. The first writing system in human history is born. It starts with the temples. Priests need to keep track of offerings made to the gods. They record how much grain each farmer contributes. They note which animals are sacrificed on which days. They track the temple's vast wealth in land, livestock, and precious goods. The earliest writing is purely practical. Numbers and pictures pressed into soft clay with a reed stylus. A picture of a bull's head means bull. A picture of a grain stalk means barley. Lines and circles represent different numbers. These simple records help temple administrators manage their complex operations. Writing spreads from the temples to the palaces. Kings want to keep records of their victories, their laws, and their building projects. Royal scribes become powerful figures, the only people who can read and write the increasingly complex symbols. The writing system evolves rapidly. Simple pictures prove inadequate for recording complex thoughts. The Sumerians develop ways to write abstract concepts. They use symbols to represent sounds rather than things. They create ways to show verb tenses, plurals, and grammatical relationships. Cuneiform, as scholars call this writing, gets its name from the wedge-shaped marks made by the reed stylus. Each symbol is built up from combinations of these wedges pressed into wet clay at different angles. The finished tablets are dried in the sun or baked in ovens to preserve them permanently. Learning to write is difficult and time-consuming. Scribes must memorize hundreds of symbols and their various meanings. They must master the complex rules of grammar and spelling. They must develop the hand strength and coordination needed to form clear, readable marks. Training takes years. Scribal schools emerge in the major cities. Young men from wealthy families spend their days copying texts, practicing writing exercises, and memorizing literature. They learn mathematics, astronomy, and law. They study the great stories of gods and heroes. They become the intellectual elite of Sumerian society. The first literature appears on clay tablets. Scribes record the traditional stories that have been passed down orally for generations. They create new works of poetry and philosophy. They write down the laws that govern society. They preserve the wisdom of the past for future generations. Writing transforms government. Kings can now send detailed orders to distant provinces. Laws can be recorded exactly and applied consistently. Treaties between cities can be written down and preserved. Diplomatic correspondence becomes possible. The scale and complexity of administration increases dramatically. Trade benefits enormously from writing. Merchants can keep accurate records of their transactions. They can write contracts that specify exact terms and conditions. They can correspond with trading partners in distant cities. They can maintain inventories of their goods. Commercial law becomes more sophisticated. Writing also changes religion. Sacred texts preserve the exact words of prayers and rituals. Myths and legends are recorded in definitive versions. Religious laws are written down and codified. The relationship between gods and mortals becomes more formal and legalistic. The social effects of writing are profound. For the first time in human history, knowledge can be preserved exactly and transmitted across generations without change. The wisdom of the past no longer depends on human memory. Ideas can spread faster and farther than ever before. But writing also creates new inequalities. Those who can read and write have access to knowledge and power. Those who cannot are excluded from important aspects of society. Literacy becomes a mark of social status. The division between educated and uneducated becomes permanent. Women rarely learn to write in early Sumer, though there are exceptions. Some priestesses are literate, a few royal women receive education, but for most women, writing remains a male skill. This limitation will affect women's participation in public life for millennia to come. The invention of writing marks a turning point in human development. Before writing, human knowledge was limited by the capacity of individual memory. After writing, knowledge can accumulate without limit. The foundation for all future intellectual achievement has been laid. In the clay tablets of ancient Sumer, we can see the beginning of history itself. For the first time, people can speak to us directly across the centuries, telling us their stories in their own words. The rise of Lagash and the rule of Urukagina. In the city of Lagash, beside the slow-moving waters of the Tigris, something important is happening. The old ways of governing are breaking down. Corruption spreads through the temples and palaces. Common people suffer while the wealthy grow richer. Social tensions rise to the breaking point. The king of Lagash dies, leaving no clear heir. The traditional assembly of elders cannot agree on a successor. Different factions support different candidates. The city teeters on the edge of civil war. Into this chaos steps a man named Urukagina, who promises to restore justice and protect the weak. Urukagina is not born to power. He comes from the ranks of temple officials, a skilled administrator who has seen how the system works from the inside. He understands the problems that plague Lagash. More importantly, he believes he can fix them. The situation in Lagash reflects problems throughout Sumer. As cities grow larger and more complex, opportunities for abuse increase. Temple officials take bribes, royal judges favor the wealthy. Tax collectors demand more than they should. Merchants cheat their customers. The powerful prey on the weak. Women suffer especially under these corrupt practices. They can be divorced arbitrarily by their husbands. They have little legal protection against abuse. They cannot inherit property easily. They are excluded from most economic activities. Their traditional rights are being eroded by the growing power of male-dominated institutions. Urukagina sees these injustices and decides to act. When he becomes king of Lagash around 2350 BCE, he implements a series of reforms designed to restore fairness and protect the vulnerable. His changes are revolutionary for their time. The new king reduces taxes and fees imposed by the temple. He limits the power of officials to extort money from citizens. He establishes fixed prices for essential goods to prevent profiteering. He creates legal protections for widows and orphans. He guarantees certain rights for women in marriage and divorce. Most importantly, Urukagina proclaims that he rules by divine command to establish justice. He claims that the god Ningirsu has ordered him to protect the poor and weak against the rich and powerful. This religious justification for social reform becomes a model for future rulers. The king's reforms are recorded on clay tablets in careful detail. These documents represent the world's first known attempt at systematic legal and social reform. They show how a ruler can use political power to address social problems and promote justice. But Urukagina's reforms face strong resistance. Wealthy merchants lose their ability to cheat customers. Corrupt officials lose their sources of illegal income. Powerful families lose some of their traditional privileges. The beneficiaries of the old system fight back. Religious conservatives argue that the reforms violate ancient traditions blessed by the gods. They claim that changing the established order will bring divine punishment. They point to natural disasters and military defeats as evidence that the gods disapprove of Urukagina's policies. The king also faces external threats. Other Sumerian cities watch Lagash's reforms with concern. If Urukagina succeeds, their own people might demand similar changes. Some rulers consider military action to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas about justice and equality. Despite these challenges, Urukagina's reforms have important effects. The economy of Lagash becomes more stable as corruption decreases. Social tensions ease as the poor receive better treatment. The city's reputation for justice attracts refugees from other cities. Trade increases as merchants trust Lagash's fair dealing. The reforms also inspire religious and intellectual developments. Priests develop new theological ideas about divine justice and royal responsibility. Scribes create literary works that celebrate the protection of the weak. Legal scholars begin to systematize laws and legal procedures. However, Urukagina's experiment in social reform proves fragile. External enemies take advantage of Lagash's internal focus on reform. Military preparedness declines as resources are devoted to social programs. The city becomes vulnerable to attack from neighbors who have maintained their focus on military power. The end comes swiftly and brutally. Lugal-Zaijisi, the ambitious ruler of nearby Umma, sees an opportunity to expand his territory. He attacks Lagash with overwhelming force, destroying the city and ending Urukagina's reign. The great reformer disappears from history, his fate unknown. But Urukagina's legacy survives in the clay tablets that record his reforms. These documents preserve the memory of humanity's first systematic attempt to use political power for social justice. They establish principles that will influence law and government for thousands of years to come. The story of Urukagina shows both the potential and the limits of reform in ancient times. Good intentions are not enough without the power to enforce them. Social change requires more than royal decree. It needs broad support and careful implementation. Most importantly, it needs protection against those who benefit from injustice. The fall of Lagash marks the end of an era in Sumerian history. The age of independent city-states is drawing to a close. Soon, a new kind of ruler will emerge, one who understands that lasting power requires military strength as much as moral authority. The Akkadian conquest, Sargon's empire. From the north comes a man who will change everything. His name is Sargon, and he leads a people called the Akkadians. They speak a different language than the Sumerians. They worship different gods. They have different customs, but they share the same land, and they want the same things: power, wealth, and glory. Sargon's origins are shrouded in legend. Some say he was found as a baby, floating in a basket on the river, rescued by a gardener and raised in humble circumstances. Others claim he was born into royalty but lost his inheritance through betrayal. What matters is not where he came from, but where he is going. The Akkadians have been living in northern Mesopotamia for centuries, working as servants and soldiers for Sumerian kings. They have learned Sumerian ways of war and government. They have studied Sumerian weaknesses. Now they are ready to turn this knowledge against their former masters. Sargon begins his career as a cupbearer to the king of Kish. This position gives him access to royal secrets and military plans. He learns how the Sumerian city-states are organized. He discovers their rivalries and feuds. He identifies the moment when they are most vulnerable to outside attack. The Sumerian cities are exhausted by generations of warfare against each other. Their armies are scattered. Their treasuries are depleted. Their people are tired of constant conflict. They are ripe for conquest by a unified force under strong leadership. Sargon first takes control of Kish through a palace coup. Then he moves against the other northern cities, one by one. His victories are swift and decisive. City after city falls to his disciplined army. Refugees stream southward, carrying news of the Akkadian advance. The southern Sumerian cities finally recognize the threat and try to unite against it. But their cooperation comes too late. Sargon has already built momentum. His army has grown with each victory. His reputation for invincibility attracts new followers. The Sumerian alliance crumbles before it can organize effective resistance. The key battle comes at the walls of Uruk, the greatest of the Sumerian cities. Lugal-Zaijisi, the king who destroyed Lagash, leads the defense. He commands the combined armies of many cities. But Sargon's forces are better organized, better equipped, and better led. The siege of Uruk ends in Akkadian victory. With Uruk's fall, Sumerian resistance collapses. City after city opens its gates to Sargon rather than face destruction. The king makes it clear that surrender will be rewarded while resistance will be punished. Most choose survival over honor. Sargon does not simply conquer the Sumerian cities. He transforms them into parts of a larger whole. For the first time in history, a single ruler controls all of Mesopotamia. The age of independent city-states is over. The age of empire has begun. The new empire stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Sargon's armies march farther than any Mesopotamian forces before them. They bring back tribute from distant lands: silver from Turkey, cedar wood from Lebanon, precious stones from Iran. The wealth of the known world flows into Akkadian coffers. Sargon establishes his capital at Akkad, a new city built to glorify his achievements. Here, he constructs palaces that dwarf the temples of the old Sumerian cities. Here, he gathers the tribute of dozens of conquered peoples. Here, he plans further conquests that will expand his empire even more. The Akkadian Empire represents a new form of political organization. Instead of loose alliances between independent cities, Sargon creates a centralized state with himself as absolute ruler. Provincial governors report directly to him. Royal officials collect taxes according to his commands. His word is law from the mountains to the sea. Sargon's military innovations make his conquests possible. He creates the world's first professional army, with soldiers who fight for pay rather than just during emergencies. He develops new weapons and tactics. He builds supply systems that allow his forces to campaign far from home. He establishes the model for imperial warfare. The cultural impact of Akkadian conquest is enormous. Sumerian and Akkadian traditions begin to merge. The Akkadians adopt Sumerian writing, adapting cuneiform to their own language. They worship Sumerian gods alongside their own deities. They preserve Sumerian literature while creating new works in their own tongue. But empire comes with costs. The constant warfare required to maintain Akkadian dominance drains resources and manpower. Conquered peoples resent foreign rule and rebel whenever possible. The administrative burden of governing diverse populations strains the royal government. Success breeds new problems. Sargon rules for more than 50 years, an extraordinarily long reign for those violent times. He dies in his palace at Akkad, surrounded by the wealth of the world's first empire. But empires, like men, are mortal. The question is not whether Sargon's empire will fall, but when and how. The great king's sons inherit more than just power. They inherit the expectations that come with imperial rule. They must be warriors, administrators, diplomats, and religious leaders all at once. They must maintain control over vast territories filled with hostile populations. They must prove themselves worthy of their father's legacy. The stage is set for the next chapter in Mesopotamian history: the rise and fall of the world's first empire. Sargon's rule and the brutality of empire power changes everything. Once Sargon held the throne of Akkad, he faced a truth that haunts every ruler. An empire is not built on hope or kindness. It survives on fear, blood, and the steady march of soldiers. The Akkadian Empire stretched like a great web across the ancient world. From the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, Sargon's armies walked roads dusty with conquest. But holding such vast lands required more than victory. It demanded a system built on iron and submission. Sargon understood this darkness. He placed his trusted men as governors in distant cities. These were not local nobles who might dream of freedom. They were Akkadians, bound to him by oath and terror. Each morning they woke, knowing their lives hung on the king's pleasure. The tribute flowed like rivers toward Akkad: silver from Anatolia, cedar wood from Lebanon, precious stones from lands whose names are lost to time. Caravans moved slowly across desert paths, heavy with wealth torn from conquered peoples. Guards watched every step, ready to kill anyone who thought of rebellion. Common people felt the weight of empire daily. Farmers worked fields that no longer belonged to their families. A portion of every harvest went to feed Akkadian soldiers. Children were taken as slaves when their parents could not pay the endless taxes. The old gods still received offerings, but now Akkadian priests watched from temple shadows. Cities that once stood proud became shadows of themselves. Uruk, where kings first ruled, now bowed before foreign masters. Ur's great ziggurat still reached toward heaven, but Akkadian banners flew from its walls. The Sumerian language slowly faded as Akkadian became the tongue of power and trade. Sargon's soldiers were everywhere. They patrolled market squares with bronze weapons gleaming. They stood guard at city gates, checking every face for signs of trouble. Their presence was a constant reminder that resistance meant death. Some learned to love their conquerors. Others nursed hatred that would burn for generations. The king himself grew darker with each passing year. Victory had taught him that mercy was weakness. When cities rebelled, he showed no pity. Entire populations were scattered to distant lands. Sacred temples were stripped of their treasures. Local rulers who dared resist found their families executed before their eyes. Yet even brutality could not silence whispers of discontent. In quiet moments, when guards dozed and markets emptied, people spoke of better days. They remembered when their own kings ruled with wisdom instead of fear. These memories became seeds of resistance, just planted deep in hearts that still dreamed of freedom. Sargon built roads to move his armies quickly. These same roads carried news of his cruelty to every corner of the empire. Stories spread of cities burned for refusing tribute, of children sold in distant markets, of ancient customs forbidden by foreign law. Each tale fed the growing anger of conquered peoples. The empire's wealth flowed upward like water toward the sun. Akkad grew magnificent while its provinces withered. Grand palaces rose where common homes once stood. Royal gardens bloomed with flowers from every land, tended by slaves who would never see their birthplaces again. This beauty was built on countless tragedies. As decades passed, Sargon's empire became a machine that devoured everything in its path. It created nothing new, only consumed what others had built. The Sumerian cities that had given birth to civilization now served as workshops for their conquerors. Innovation slowed as energy turned toward survival and submission. The aging king looked out from his palace windows at a world transformed by his ambition. He had achieved what no man before him dared imagine. Yet victory tasted bitter in his mouth. His empire was strong, but it was also hollow. Built on fear, it could only endure as long as that fear remained sharp. And fear, like all things, fades with time. Naramsin, god of Akkad. 60 years after Sargon's death, his bloodline produced a man drunk on power beyond measure. Naramsin wore the crown of Akkad, but earthly kingship no longer satisfied his hunger. He would claim something far more dangerous, divinity itself. The grandson of Sargon gazed upon an empire that stretched from mountain peaks to southern marshes. Gold flowed into his treasury. Armies obeyed his every command. Yet mortal glory felt small in his hands. Other kings ruled cities. He would rule as the gods ruled, with absolute authority over both earth and heaven. The moment came during a great festival in Akkad. Before thousands of his subjects, Naramsin declared himself divine. Priests placed a horned crown upon his head, the sacred symbol of godhood. Scribes carved his new title into stone tablets. Naramsin, king of the four quarters, god of Akkad. The crowd fell silent, uncertain whether to worship or flee. This act shattered ancient tradition like pottery thrown against stone. For countless generations, kings had ruled as servants of the gods, not as gods themselves. They built temples and offered sacrifices to curry divine favor. Naramsin reversed this cosmic order. He demanded that temples be built for him. His subjects would pray to his image and burn incense in his name. The empire trembled at this bold blasphemy. In distant provinces, governors wondered if they should follow their king into sacrilege. Some cities quietly refused to acknowledge his divine status. Others, fearing his wrath, erected statues of the god king in their temple courtyards. The unity that held the empire together began to crack. Naramsin celebrated his transformation with spectacular monuments. He commissioned sculptors to carve his image as a giant figure climbing mountains, crushing enemies beneath his feet. Victory steles showed him receiving worship from lesser beings. Every artwork proclaimed the same message. The king was no longer bound by mortal limits. His armies marched with renewed ferocity. When enemies faced the forces of a living god, terror preceded every battle. Cities surrendered without siege rather than risk divine punishment. Trade routes expanded as merchants sought the favor of one who claimed power over storms and harvests. For a time, hubris seemed to bring only success. The god king's court became a strange theater of forced devotion. Nobles prostrated themselves before his throne as they once did before altar stones. Priests offered prayers to Naramsin alongside ancient deities. Children learned to speak his name with the same reverence their parents showed to Enlil and Inanna. Yet claiming godhood is easier than maintaining it. Divine authority requires constant proof of divine power. When drought struck the empire's heartland, whispers began. What god allows his people to starve? When plagues swept through Akkadian armies, doubts multiplied. Would a true deity not protect his chosen warriors? Naramsin responded to these challenges with increasing violence. Cities that questioned his divine nature faced immediate destruction. Rebellious priests disappeared in the night. The God King's paranoia grew with each threat to his celestial authority. He saw enemies in every shadow, heretics in every hesitation. Foreign powers watched Akkad's internal struggles with growing interest. The Gutians, fierce mountain warriors, began testing the empire's borders. Elamites pressed from the east. Other kingdoms, once cowed by Akkadian might, sensed weakness behind the facade of divine rule. The God King's enemies multiplied like stars in the evening sky. The empire's resources were stretched thin, maintaining the illusion of divine monarchy. Vast sums went to building monuments that glorified Naramsin rather than strengthening defenses. Soldiers who should have guarded frontiers instead protected temples dedicated to their living god. Priorities shifted from practical governance to cosmic theater. In quiet moments, even Naramsin must have wondered at the path he had chosen. The crown of godhood weighed heavier than any mortal burden. Every decision carried eternal consequences. Every failure challenged not just his rule, but his very nature. He had climbed higher than any king before him, but the fall from such heights would be devastating. Ancient texts speak of omens that plagued his later years. Eclipses darkened the sky during royal ceremonies. Birds fell dead from heaven. Rivers ran backward for no earthly reason. Whether real or imagined, these signs fed growing belief that the gods were angry. Divine justice was coming for the mortal who dared claim equality with heaven. The God King ruled from his palace, surrounded by magnificent lies. His subjects bowed and worshipped, but their hearts remained unconvinced. Power built on such shaky foundations cannot endure forever. Naramsin had reached for immortality and grasped only the wind. The fall of Akkad, the mysterious collapse. The greatest empire the world had ever known vanished like morning mist. After ruling for nearly 2 centuries, Akkad simply ceased to exist. Cities fell silent, trade routes emptied, the machinery of power ground to a halt, leaving only questions that echo through time. The collapse began subtly, like cracks in a dam wall. Harvests failed across the northern plains year after year. The life-giving rains that had blessed Mesopotamia for generations simply stopped coming. Rivers that once ran full became shallow streams. Wells that had never run dry turned to dust. Ancient tablets speak of 7 years without proper rainfall, 7 years of withered grain and starving cattle, 7 years of watching the sky for clouds that never came. The drought was unlike anything in living memory. Even the oldest priests had no rituals to end such suffering. Famine stalked the empire like a hungry wolf. In the countryside, farmers abandoned fields that would no longer yield crops. They walked towards cities, carrying their children and hoping for mercy. But the cities had no food to spare. Granaries that once overflowed stood empty. The streets filled with desperate people competing for scraps. The Akkadian military, once the terror of the known world, began to dissolve. Soldiers deserted their posts to search for food for their families. Those who remained demanded payment that empty treasuries could not provide. The empire's famous bronze weapons were traded for bags of grain. Fortresses stood abandoned as their garrisons melted away. From the northern mountains came new enemies. The Gutians, wild tribes who had always lived beyond civilization's reach, smelled weakness in the wind. They descended like locusts, raiding settlements that could no longer defend themselves. These mountain warriors fought with primitive weapons but devastating hunger. They took everything and left nothing behind. The Gutian invasion was unlike previous conquests. They did not seek to rule or build. They came to destroy and plunder. Cities that surrendered were looted and abandoned. Those that resisted were burned to ash. The complex administration that held the empire together crumbled as Gutian war bands roamed freely across the land. King Shar Kali Shari, Naramsin's son, tried desperately to hold his inheritance together. He fought campaign after campaign against enemies who multiplied faster than he could defeat them. His armies won victories that meant nothing. For every Gutian band destroyed, 2 more appeared from the mountain passes. The empire's trade networks collapsed like a house of reeds. Merchants who had carried goods across thousands of miles found their routes blocked by bandits and chaos. The silver and gold that had flowed toward Akkad dried up. Cities that depended on trade for survival withered and died. The economic heart of the empire stopped beating. Internal rebellion added to external pressure. Cities that had chafed under Akkadian rule saw opportunity in the empire's weakness. Local governors declared independence. Ancient Sumerian cities like Uruk and Lagash threw off foreign control and crowned their own kings. The empire fractured into countless competing fragments. Religious authority crumbled alongside political power. Priests who had proclaimed the divine right of Akkadian kings found their temples empty of worshippers. The gods, it seemed, had abandoned their earthly representatives. People turned to older deities, local spirits who might show more mercy than the distant powers of empire. Archaeological evidence suggests that entire regions were simply abandoned during this period. Settlements that had thriving for centuries show layers of dust and neglect. No signs of violent destruction, just gradual emptiness as people walked away from homes that could no longer sustain life. The land itself seemed to reject human presence. Climate scientists today believe a massive drought struck the region around 2200 BCE. Volcanic eruptions or shifts in ocean currents may have altered weather patterns across the Middle East. The empire that Sargon built with blood and bronze could not survive when the rains failed and the earth turned against it. By 2154 BCE, the last Akkadian king was dead. No heir claimed his throne. The great capital city of Akkad emptied as its people scattered to find new homes. Within a single generation, the world's first empire had become a memory. Its collapse was so complete that archaeologists still search for the location of Akkad itself. The fall holds lessons that echo through history. Empires built on conquest and tribute are fragile things. When external pressure meets internal weakness, even the mightiest powers can vanish overnight. The Akkadians had ruled the world, but they could not rule the weather. In the end, that was enough to destroy them. The Sumerian Renaissance, the third dynasty of Ur. From the ashes of the Akkadian collapse, an ancient people stirred once more. The Sumerians, creators of the first cities, inventors of writing, builders of the first ziggurats, reclaimed their homeland. Like phoenixes rising from flames, they would build one last golden age. The Gutians had ruled the south for decades, but their reign was chaos incarnate. These mountain warriors understood destruction, but not creation. They took tribute, but built nothing. They conquered cities, but could not govern them. The sophisticated civilization of Mesopotamia withered under their crude dominance. Into this darkness stepped a man named Utu-Hagal of Uruk. He gathered the scattered remnants of Sumerian pride and forged them into an army of liberation. City by city, his forces drove the Gutians back toward their mountain homes. The foreigners who had terrorized the land fled like shadows before dawn light. Victory brought Utu-Hagal great fame, but his triumph was brief. Power passed to his general, Ur-Nammu, who founded something far greater than military success. He established the third dynasty of Ur, which would rule southern Mesopotamia for over a century. This became the Sumerian Renaissance, a final flowering of their ancient genius. Ur-Nammu was both warrior and builder, conqueror and creator. He understood that lasting power required more than sharp bronze and loyal soldiers. A kingdom needed law, order, and the steady rhythm of daily life. He set about rebuilding what the long years of chaos had destroyed. The king's first great work was legal reform. He created one of the world's earliest law codes, predating even Hammurabi's famous tablets. These laws were not carved to glorify royal power, but to protect the weak from the strong. They set fair prices for goods, established punishments for crimes, and guaranteed basic rights even for common people. Ur-Nammu turned his attention to the sacred architecture that defined Sumerian civilization. Across his kingdom, ancient ziggurats rose again from rubble and neglect. The great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, became a marvel that visitors came from distant lands to witness. Its massive steps climbed toward heaven like a stairway for gods. These were not mere monuments to royal ego. The ziggurats served as the economic and spiritual hearts of their communities. Priests managed vast estates from temple complexes. They organized irrigation projects, stored grain reserves, and coordinated trade expeditions. The temples were banks, schools, and hospitals rolled into one. Under Ur-Nammu and his successors, Sumerian culture bloomed once more. Scribes copied ancient texts that had nearly been lost during the Dark Years. Poets composed new hymns to old gods. Artists created sculptures and jewelry that rivaled the finest work of earlier centuries. The written word flourished as never before. The dynasty's administrative system was a wonder of organization. Thousands of clay tablets from this period survive, recording everything from temple inventories to legal contracts. Every sheep, every jar of oil, every day of labor was carefully documented. This bureaucracy may seem dull to modern eyes, but it enabled prosperity on a scale that amazed contemporary observers. Trade networks that had collapsed under Gutian rule came back to life. Sumerian merchants once again traveled to distant lands, carrying wool and grain to exchange for metals and precious stones. The Persian Gulf saw fleets of reed boats carrying goods between southern cities and foreign ports. Prosperity returned to the land between the rivers. King Shulgi, Ur-Nammu's son, ruled for nearly 50 years and brought the dynasty to its greatest heights. He claimed to be able to run from Nippur to Ur, a distance of over 100 miles, in a single day. Whether true or not, this boast captured the energy and ambition of the age. Everything seemed possible again. The Sumerian language enjoyed its final period of glory during these decades. Royal inscriptions, religious hymns, and administrative documents were all written in the tongue that had first given voice to human civilization. Sumerian schools trained scribes who carried this ancient wisdom throughout the known world. Yet even this renaissance carried the seeds of its own decline. The third dynasty of Ur was the last time ethnic Sumerians would rule their homeland. Semitic peoples, relatives of the Akkadians, were settling throughout Mesopotamia in ever greater numbers. The Sumerian language was slowly giving way to Akkadian as the speech of daily life. The dynasty faced the same challenges that had destroyed its predecessors. Maintaining control over distant cities required constant military campaigns. Nomadic tribes pressed against the kingdom's borders. Climate remained unpredictable, bringing periodic droughts that stressed the agricultural foundation of civilization. Around 2004 BCE, the end came with startling suddenness. Elamite armies swept down from the eastern mountains and captured Ur itself. The last king, Ibbi-Sin, was dragged away in chains to die in a foreign land. With his capture, both the dynasty and effective Sumerian political power came to an end. The third dynasty of Ur was Sumer's swan song, beautiful and final. It proved that even after conquest and chaos, the human spirit could rebuild and create anew. The Sumerians gave the world its last gift, proof that civilization, once kindled, burns too brightly to be easily extinguished. Daily life in Sumer, class, law, and survival life in ancient Sumer moved to rhythms older than memory. The sun rose over reed marshes and mudrick walls. Farmers walked to their fields as they had for countless generations. In the cities, merchants opened their shops while priests climbed ziggurat steps to greet the dawn gods. This was the daily dance of survival and hope. Society was built like a pyramid, with each person knowing their place from birth to death. At the top sat the king, chosen by gods to rule over mortals. Below him came the nobles and priests, men who owned vast estates and controlled the flow of grain and silver. Their lives were comfortable, filled with fine food, beautiful clothes, and servants to handle unpleasant tasks. The largest group were the free farmers and craftsmen, people who owned their own small plots of land or workshops. These families worked hard but lived decently. A farmer might own a few sheep, a donkey, and a house made of sundried brick. His wife would weave cloth and tend a small garden. Their children would help with the work and learn the skills they would need as adults. At the bottom of the pyramid were the slaves, people who had lost their freedom through war, debt, or birth. Some slaves worked in the fields under the burning sun. Others served in wealthy households, cooking meals and caring for children. A few fortunate ones became skilled craftsmen or even administrators, but they remained property that could be bought and sold like livestock. The law touched every aspect of daily life, from the price of bread to the punishment for adultery. Judges sat in the shade of city gates, listening to disputes and pronouncing verdicts. Their decisions were based on ancient customs and royal decrees, carefully recorded on clay tablets by scribes who charged fees for their services. Marriage was both a romantic bond and a business arrangement. Families negotiated bride prices and dowries with the care of merchants striking deals. A young woman would leave her father's house to join her husband's family, bringing with her personal possessions and legal rights. Divorce was possible but complicated, requiring formal procedures and the return of various payments. Children were treasures in a world where many died young. Parents celebrated each birthday as a victory over the diseases and accidents that claimed so many small lives. Boys learned their father's trades, whether farming, pottery making, or temple service. Girls helped their mothers with household tasks and learned the complex skills of managing a family. Work began before sunrise and continued until darkness fell. Farmers tended their barley and wheat fields, fighting an endless battle against weeds, insects, and the unpredictable floods of the two great rivers. In good years, the harvest was abundant. In bad years, families faced hunger and debt. Craftsmen worked in specialized workshops scattered throughout the cities. Potters shaped clay vessels on wheels turned by their feet. Metal workers smelted copper and tin to create bronze tools and weapons. Textile workers spun thread from wool and flax, then wove it into cloth that was traded across the known world. The marketplace was the beating heart of every city. Here, farmers sold their produce and craftsmen displayed their wares. Professional merchants, some traveling from distant lands, offered exotic goods like incense, precious stones, and rare metals. Buyers and sellers haggled over prices while guards kept watch for thieves and troublemakers. Religion provided comfort and structure in a dangerous world. People made daily offerings to household gods who protected their families. They visited temple complexes to ask for blessings from major deities like Enlil and Inanna. Festival days brought entire communities together for processions, feasts, and ceremonies that reinforced social bonds. Food was simple but nourishing when available. The wealthy enjoyed meat, fish, dates, and beer made from barley. Common people ate mostly bread, vegetables, and porridge, with occasional treats of honey or dried fruit. Everyone, rich and poor, drank beer because it was safer than water and provided important nutrients. Disease was a constant threat in crowded cities where sanitation was primitive. People relied on prayers, herbal remedies, and the occasional intervention of physician priests who combined medical knowledge with religious ritual. Epidemics could sweep through entire neighborhoods, leaving empty houses and grieving families in their wake. Entertainment helped people forget their troubles for a few precious hours. Musicians played harps and drums at festivals and private celebrations. Storytellers recounted ancient tales of gods and heroes. Board games provided amusement for those who could afford the carved pieces and gaming boards. Women's lives were constrained by laws and customs that gave most authority to men, but they were not powerless. Some women owned property, operated businesses, and served as priestesses in important temples. A widow could inherit her husband's estate and make decisions about her children's futures. The rhythm of the seasons governed everything. Spring brought planting time and hope for good harvests. Summer meant long days of hard work under the merciless sun. Autumn brought harvest festivals and thanksgiving to the gods. Winter was a time of rest, repair, and planning for the year ahead. Death, when it came, was met with elaborate rituals designed to help the deceased journey safely to the underworld. Families buried their loved ones with food, tools, and other necessities for the afterlife. The wealthy were interred in decorated tombs with rich grave goods. The poor made do with simple burials, but even they received the basic rites that honored the dead. This was life in ancient Sumer, harsh and brief by modern standards, but filled with the same hopes, fears, and dreams that drive humanity in every age. People loved their families, worked for better lives, and looked to the gods for protection in an uncertain world. Hammurabi and the rise of Babylon. A small city on the Euphrates River was about to change the world forever. Babylon had existed in the shadow of greater powers for centuries, paying tribute to stronger neighbors and dreaming of independence. Then came a king whose vision transformed a minor trading post into the heart of an empire that would endure for over 1,000 years. Hammurabi ascended the throne of Babylon around 1792 BCE, inheriting a city-state that controlled perhaps 50 miles of river valley. Other kings might have been content with such modest holdings, But Hammurabi possessed something rare among rulers. He combined the patience of a chess master with the ruthless ambition of a conqueror. The young king spent his early years watching and learning. To the north, Assyria flexed its growing military strength. In the south, the ancient Sumerian cities maintained their proud independence. To the east, Elam threatened the trade routes that fed Mesopotamian prosperity. Hammurabi studied them all, waiting for the right moment to strike. His opportunity came through careful diplomacy rather than sudden war. Hammurabi forged alliances with some neighbors while secretly preparing to betray others. He signed treaties of friendship while building the military strength to break them. This was not honor in the ancient sense, but it was effective statecraft. The conquest of southern Mesopotamia unfolded over decades like a slow-burning fire. Hammurabi first absorbed the nearby city of Sippar through a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering. Then came Isin, then Uruk, then the great prize of Larsa. Each victory brought new resources and strategic advantages. The siege of Larsa marked Hammurabi's transformation from regional player to imperial power. This ancient city had resisted Babylonian expansion for years, trusting in its strong walls and alliance with Elam. Hammurabi starved it into submission through a patient blockade that lasted months. When Larsa's gates finally opened, all of southern Mesopotamia lay at his feet. Mari, the great trading city on the upper Euphrates, presented a different kind of challenge. Its king, Zimri-Lim, had been Hammurabi's ally and friend. They exchanged letters filled with warm greetings and mutual respect. Yet when Mari's wealth became too tempting to ignore, Hammurabi struck without warning. Friendship meant nothing when empire was at stake. The destruction of Mari sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. Here was a city that had trusted in Babylonian honor, only to be betrayed and burned. Hammurabi's reputation for treachery spread along every trade route. Future enemies would know better than to trust his promises of peace. By 1750 BCE, Hammurabi ruled an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the edges of Anatolia. Babylon, once a minor river port, had become the greatest city in the world. Its population swelled, with merchants, craftsmen, and administrators drawn by the opportunities that empire provided. The king proved as skilled at governing as he had been at conquering. He rebuilt ancient irrigation systems that had fallen into disrepair during decades of warfare. Trade flourished under the protection of Babylonian armies. The arts and sciences found generous royal patronage in a court that celebrated both power and culture. Hammurabi's greatest achievement was not military but legal. The famous Code of Hammurabi, carved on a black stone pillar over 7 feet tall, established a unified legal system for his diverse empire. This was not merely a collection of royal decrees, but a comprehensive attempt to create justice through written law. The code addressed everything from property rights to family relationships. It set standard weights and measures for trade. It established procedures for legal proceedings. It defined crimes and their punishments. Most importantly, it proclaimed that even kings were bound by law rather than ruling through arbitrary will. Yet for all its famous principles, the code also reflected the harsh realities of ancient power. Punishments were severe and often brutal. Social distinctions were rigidly maintained. The wealthy received different treatment than the poor. Justice was not blind, but carefully calibrated to preserve existing hierarchies. Hammurabi's Babylon became a magnet for talent from across the known world. Scribes came to study Akkadian, which became the international language of diplomacy and trade. Mathematicians developed new techniques for calculating areas and volumes. Astronomers mapped the movements of stars and planets with unprecedented precision. The king himself was a hands-on administrator who personally reviewed important decisions. Thousands of letters survive from his correspondence with provincial governors. He concerned himself with everything from tax collection to canal maintenance. This attention to detail helped hold his empire together where others had failed. Religious policy required delicate balance in a realm that included dozens of ancient cities, each with its own patron deities. Hammurabi elevated Marduk, Babylon's god, to the head of the pantheon without completely suppressing local traditions. This compromise satisfied most of his subjects while establishing Babylonian spiritual authority. The empire's prosperity attracted enemies like honey draws flies. Hittites raided from the northwest. Cassites pressed from the eastern mountains. Internal rebellions flared when provincial governors grew too ambitious. Hammurabi spent his later years fighting to preserve what his earlier conquests had created. When death finally claimed him around 1750 BCE, Hammurabi left behind an empire that would outlast most of its ancient rivals. His legal code would influence lawmaking for millennia to come. His transformation of Babylon from minor city to imperial capital would echo through history until Alexander the Great walked its streets over 1,000 years later. The rise of Babylon under Hammurabi proved that empire could be built through patient planning as well as brilliant warfare. More importantly, it showed that conquest without governance is merely organized destruction. Hammurabi's true genius lay not in taking cities, but in making them work together as something greater than the sum of their parts. The Code of Hammurabi, justice, written in stone. In the shadow of Babylon's great ziggurat stood a pillar of black stone that would change human history. Nearly 8 feet tall and covered with dense rows of cuneiform script, this monument contained something unprecedented, a comprehensive legal code that applied to every person in the empire, from the humblest slave to the king himself. Hammurabi did not invent law, but he revolutionized it. Before his code, justice was a matter of local custom and royal whim. Different cities followed different traditions. Judges made decisions based on ancient precedents that few could remember clearly. The wealthy could buy favorable verdicts, while the poor suffered whatever punishment their betters deemed appropriate. The Great Stone changed everything. For the first time in human history, laws were written down for all to see. No longer could judges claim ignorance of proper procedures. No longer could the powerful twist justice to serve their personal interests. The law had become bigger than any individual, even the king who created it. The code begins with a magnificent prologue that establishes Hammurabi's divine authority to rule and judge. The gods themselves, it proclaims, chose him to bring justice to the land and protect the weak from the strong. This was not mere royal propaganda, but a revolutionary concept. Kings had always claimed divine support for their wars and conquests. Hammurabi claimed divine support for justice itself. What follows are 282 laws that cover nearly every aspect of daily life in ancient Babylon. Property disputes, family relationships, business contracts, personal injuries, adultery, military service, priestly duties, all received detailed treatment. The code sought to anticipate every possible conflict and provide clear guidance for its resolution. The famous principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth appears throughout the code. But this was not primitive vengeance. It was sophisticated justice that required punishments to match crimes exactly. Before Hammurabi, a minor offense might result in death if the victim was powerful enough. The code established proportional punishment that protected both criminals and victims from excessive retribution. Social distinctions were carefully preserved within the legal framework. The code recognized 3 classes of people: free citizens, commoners, and slaves. Each group received different treatment under the law. A noble who injured another noble faced harsh punishment, but the same injury inflicted on a slave resulted in only a small fine. This may seem unjust by modern standards, but it brought predictability to a world where law had previously been arbitrary. Women's rights received surprisingly detailed attention in an age when females were generally considered property. Wives could initiate divorce proceedings under certain circumstances. They could inherit property from their husbands and pass it on to their children. Women who operated businesses enjoyed legal protection for their commercial activities. These provisions were limited and unequal, but they represented progress in societies where women had previously enjoyed no legal standing whatsoever. The code's approach to economic life reveals a sophisticated understanding of trade and commerce. It established standard weights and measures that applied throughout the empire. It set maximum interest rates for loans. It created procedures for resolving business disputes. It even addressed the problem of false advertising, prescribing punishments for merchants who misrepresented their goods. Contract law received extensive treatment because written agreements were becoming increasingly important in Babylonian society. The code specified how contracts should be formed, what made them valid, and how they could be enforced. It addressed situations where contracts could not be fulfilled due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. This legal framework made long-distance trade and complex business arrangements possible on a scale never before achieved. Family law formed a large portion of the code, reflecting the central importance of kinship in ancient society. Marriage contracts, inheritance rights, adoption procedures, and divorce settlements all received detailed regulation. The code even addressed situations where family members might be sold into slavery to pay debts, limiting such practices while acknowledging their economic necessity. Criminal law occupied a prominent place in the code, establishing clear definitions of crimes and their punishments. Murder, theft, adultery, and perjury all carried specific penalties that judges were required to impose. This removed discretion that had often been abused and created a predictable system where people could understand the consequences of their actions in advance. Professional standards appeared throughout the code, reflecting the specialized nature of Babylonian society. Doctors who killed patients through incompetence faced severe punishment. Builders whose houses collapsed and killed their occupants could be executed. Judges who made corrupt decisions were publicly disgraced and removed from office. These provisions encouraged professional competence while protecting the public from malpractice. The code's treatment of evidence and legal procedures established principles that still influence modern legal systems. Witnesses were required to swear oaths before testifying. False testimony was harshly punished. Judges had to make decisions based on evidence rather than personal opinion. Appeals processes allowed wrongly convicted individuals to seek justice from higher authorities. Perhaps most revolutionary was the code's public nature. The great stone pillar stood in Babylon's main square where anyone could see it. Copies were carved and erected in major cities throughout the empire. For the first time, ordinary people could know what the law required of them and what protections it provided. Knowledge of the law was no longer restricted to a small class of professional judges and scribes. The Code of Hammurabi was not perfect justice by any measure. It preserved social inequalities and imposed punishments that seem barbaric today. Yet it represented a giant leap forward in human civilization. It established the principle that law should be written, public, and applied equally to all people within the same social class. It created predictable consequences for actions, making social cooperation and economic planning possible on an unprecedented scale. When the Great Stone was discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists, it had been broken into 3 pieces and carried away from Babylon as a trophy of war. Even in fragments, its message remained clear. Justice, once carved in stone, becomes something larger than the king who created it. It becomes a foundation upon which entire civilizations can build their hopes for fairness and order. Babylonian culture, science, and religion. In the bustling streets of Babylon, beneath the shadow of the great ziggurat of Marduk, a new kind of civilization was taking shape. This was not just another conquered city, but a melting pot where ancient wisdom met fresh ideas. Here, priests doubled as mathematicians, merchants studied the stars, and scribes preserved knowledge that would outlast empires. The Babylonians inherited the mathematical genius of their Sumerian predecessors and transformed it into something extraordinary. They developed a number system based on 60 that still governs how we measure time and angles today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are Babylonian gifts to the modern world. Their mathematicians could solve complex problems that would challenge students today. They calculated square roots and cube roots with remarkable accuracy. They developed methods for finding areas of irregular shapes and volumes of complex structures. Most impressive of all, they solved quadratic equations over 1,000 years before Greek mathematicians would rediscover these techniques. Clay tablets from Babylonian schools reveal sophisticated mathematical exercises. Students learn to calculate compound interest, determine the amount of grain that could be stored in cylindrical silos, and figure out how long it would take workers to complete major construction projects. Mathematics was not abstract theory, but practical knowledge essential for running an empire. Astronomy reached heights in Babylon that would not be surpassed for centuries. Priest astronomers maintained careful records of celestial movements from temple observatories. They tracked the paths of planets with such precision that their calculations remained useful to astronomers well into the modern era. Their observations laid the foundation for scientific astronomy. The Babylonian calendar was a marvel of astronomical calculation. They recognized that neither lunar months nor solar years fit together neatly, so they developed a complex system that added extra months at regular intervals to keep festivals aligned with seasons. This mathematical solution to celestial mechanics influenced calendar making throughout the ancient world. Their astronomical texts revealed deep understanding of planetary motions. They could predict eclipses years in advance. They identified the zodiac constellations and tracked the movements of planets through them. They even recognized that Venus, as both morning and evening star, was actually the same celestial body. Medicine in Babylon blended scientific observation with religious belief. Physician priests studied symptoms and prescribed treatments based on careful diagnosis. They performed surgery, set broken bones, and treated eye diseases with remarkable skill. Medical texts describe hundreds of remedies using herbs, minerals, and other natural substances. The famous Diagnostic Handbook, compiled by a physician named Asagil Kin Apli, contained detailed descriptions of diseases and their treatments. This medical encyclopedia was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, spreading Babylonian medical knowledge throughout the ancient world. It represented one of humanity's first systematic approaches to understanding illness and health. Babylonian religion evolved from ancient Sumerian roots into something uniquely urban and sophisticated. The pantheon was reorganized with Marduk, patron god of Babylon, at its head. The creation epic Enuma Elish told how Marduk defeated the chaos goddess Tiamat and organized the universe. This myth justified Babylonian political supremacy while explaining the cosmic order. Religious festivals brought the entire city together in spectacular celebrations. The New Year festival lasted 11 days and involved elaborate processions, ritual dramas, and public feasts. The king himself participated in ceremonies that renewed his divine authority and ensured the kingdom's prosperity for another year. Temple complexes served as more than religious centers. They were universities where priests studied astronomy and mathematics. They were banks where merchants deposited silver and farmers borrowed seed grain. They were hospitals where the sick sought both medical treatment and divine healing. These institutions made urban civilization possible. Literature flourished in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Hammurabi's empire. Scribes copied ancient Sumerian texts while creating new works in Akkadian. The Epic of Gilgamesh reached its classical form during this period, becoming one of world literature's greatest achievements. Stories, hymns, and wisdom texts poured from Babylonian scriptoriums. The arts reflected the empire's wealth and cultural sophistication. Sculptors created magnificent reliefs for palace walls. Jewelers worked gold and precious stones into elaborate ornaments. Textile workers produced fabrics so fine that they became luxury goods traded across the known world. Babylonian craftsmanship set standards that other cultures tried to match. Music played a central role in both religious and secular life. Temple musicians performed complex compositions during religious ceremonies. Court musicians entertained at royal banquets. Common people sang work songs and folk ballads that preserved ancient traditions. Musical instruments from Babylon influenced instrument making throughout the region. The legal tradition that began with Hammurabi's code continued to evolve. Later Babylonian law collections refined and expanded legal principles. Thousands of contracts, court records, and legal commentaries survive, revealing a sophisticated understanding of jurisprudence. Babylonian legal concepts influenced lawmaking in many successor civilizations. Education in Babylon was practical and comprehensive. Students learned to read and write in both Sumerian and Akkadian. They studied mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, and literature. The curriculum prepared them for careers as scribes, administrators, priests, or merchants. Literacy was the key to advancement in Babylonian society. Women in Babylon enjoyed more rights and opportunities than in many ancient societies. Some became priestesses who wielded considerable religious authority. Others operated businesses or inherited property from their families. Female scribes, though rare, are documented in temple records. The The law protected women's rights in marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Trade networks radiating from Babylon carried more than goods. They spread Babylonian culture, law, and knowledge throughout the ancient world. Merchants traveling to distant lands brought back new ideas that enriched Babylonian civilization. This cultural exchange made Babylon truly cosmopolitan. The legacy of Babylonian science and culture far outlasted the empire itself. Their mathematical methods influenced Greek geometry. Their astronomical observations provided data for later scientific breakthroughs. Their medical texts were studied by physicians for centuries. Their legal principles shaped jurisprudence throughout the ancient world. In quiet temple schools and busy market squares, beneath star-filled skies and within lamp-lit workshops, the Babylonians built something remarkable. They created a civilization that valued knowledge, celebrated learning, and preserved wisdom for future generations. Their intellectual achievements remind us that human curiosity and creativity can flourish even in the most turbulent times. The rise of the Cassites and foreign powers' power in Mesopotamia was about to change hands once again. The great empire that Hammurabi had built would not survive the ambitions of his weaker successors. From the mountains and steppes came new peoples hungry for the wealth that flowed through Babylonian cities. The age of native rule was ending. The decline began slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a dam. Hammurabi's son and grandson ruled competently, but without their ancestors' genius. They maintained the empire through routine administration rather than inspired leadership. The great conquests were finished, and the hard work of governing diverse peoples had begun. External pressures mounted with each passing decade. Hittite raiders from Anatolia struck deep into Mesopotamian territory, seeking plunder and slaves. These Indo-European warriors brought iron weapons and horse-drawn chariots that gave them significant advantages over traditional Babylonian forces. Their hit-and-run tactics avoided decisive battles while bleeding the empire dry. The most devastating blow came in 1595 BCE, when Hittite king Mursili I led a lightning campaign down the Euphrates River. His army reached Babylon itself, sacked the great city, and carried away its treasures. Though the Hittites quickly withdrew to their distant homeland, the psychological impact was enormous. Babylon, the greatest city in the world, had been humbled by foreign barbarians. Into this power vacuum stepped a people who would rule Babylon for over 4 centuries. The Cassites came from the Zagros Mountains, tribal peoples who had been slowly infiltrating Mesopotamia for generations. Unlike previous conquerors who destroyed and departed, the Cassites came to stay. They adopted Babylonian culture while bringing their own traditions to the ancient land. The early Cassite period remains mysterious because these mountain people initially had no writing system. They governed through oral tradition and personal relationships rather than the elaborate bureaucracies that previous rulers had favored. This simpler approach may have been exactly what war-weary Mesopotamia needed. Cassite kings took Babylonian names and worshipped Babylonian gods, but they never forgot their mountain heritage. They brought new military techniques, including extensive use of horses and improved bronze weapons. Their royal guard consisted of fierce mountain warriors who owed personal loyalty to the king rather than abstract loyalty to the state. Under Cassite rule, Babylon slowly recovered from the chaos of the Hittite raid. Trade routes reopened as merchants learned to trust the new regime's protection. Temple construction resumed as prosperity returned to the land. The irrigation systems that sustained civilization received careful maintenance and gradual expansion. The Cassites proved remarkably adaptable rulers. They maintained Babylonian legal traditions while adding their own customs to the mix. They preserved the Akkadian language for official business, while continuing to speak their native tongue among themselves. This cultural flexibility helped them win acceptance from their Mesopotamian subjects. International diplomacy flourished during the Cassite period as never before. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt, reveal extensive correspondence between Cassite kings and other major powers of the time. These clay tablets show a world where great powers negotiated marriages, traded gifts, and settled disputes through formal protocols. The Cassites established marriage alliances with Egyptian pharaohs, sending princesses to become queens in the land of the Nile. Gold flowed north from Nubian mines, while Mesopotamian textiles and crafted goods traveled south. This diplomatic network brought unprecedented stability to the entire region. Economic prosperity returned gradually under Cassite administration. They reorganized land tenure, giving greater security to farmers and encouraging agricultural investment. New crops were introduced from their mountain homeland. Population levels recovered from the devastation of previous wars and invasions. Religious life under the Cassites blended old and new traditions. They rebuilt ancient temples while introducing their own mountain deities to the Babylonian pantheon. Kurigalzu, one of their greatest kings, founded a new capital city named after himself. Its ziggurat rivaled even ancient Babylon in size and magnificence. The Cassite military was formidable but not innovative. They adopted existing Mesopotamian military traditions while adding their own mountain fighting techniques. Their armies were professional forces maintained year-round rather than seasonal levies of farmers and craftsmen. This military professionalism helped maintain order throughout their vast territories. Administrative records from the Cassite period reveal a government that was both efficient and relatively benevolent. Tax burdens were lighter than under previous regimes. Legal procedures remained fair and predictable. The harsh punishments of earlier law codes gave way to more measured justice that emphasized compensation over retribution. Yet the Cassites never fully integrated with their subjects. They remained a ruling minority that governed through strength rather than cultural unity. As generations passed, this separation became a source of weakness. Native Babylonians began to resent foreign rule, even when that rule was competent and fair. External threats continued to multiply during the later Cassite period. Assyria was rising in the north, hungry for Babylonian wealth and territory. Elamites pressed from the east, launching periodic raids into Mesopotamian heartland. New waves of nomadic peoples moved across the steppes seeking new homes and plunder. The end came suddenly around 1155 BCE when Elamite armies swept into Babylonia and captured the last Cassite king. Like the Hittites before them, the Elamites came for plunder rather than conquest. They carried away the famous code of Hammurabi along with countless other treasures, leaving Babylon weakened and vulnerable. The Cassite period proved that successful rule required more than military might or administrative skill. It required the consent of the governed and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The Cassites had governed well for 4 centuries, but they remained outsiders to the end. When crisis came, their subjects felt no deep loyalty to defend foreign kings, no matter how benevolent their rule had been. The fall of the Cassites marked the end of another chapter in Mesopotamian history. Once again, the land between the rivers would belong to new masters with fresh ideas about power and governance. The cycle of conquest and collapse would continue, but each iteration left its mark on the evolving civilization that had begun in Sumerian cities thousands of years before. The Assyrian origins, from minor city to military machine. In the rolling hills of northern Mesopotamia stood a city that would one day terrorize the ancient world. Ashur was neither large nor wealthy in the early centuries. It possessed no great river valleys, no abundant farmland, no natural harbors. Yet from this modest beginning would emerge the most efficient military machine the world had ever seen. The people of Ashur were traders before they became conquerors. Their city sat at the crossroads of important trade routes linking the mountains of Anatolia with the river valleys of Babylon. Assyrian merchants traveled vast distances, establishing trading posts from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. They learned languages, customs, and military techniques from dozens of different peoples. Early Assyrian history is recorded in merchant archives found in central Anatolia. These clay tablets reveal a people obsessed with profit and precise record-keeping. Every transaction was documented. Every debt was remembered. Every contract was enforced. This commercial discipline would later serve them well in building and maintaining an empire. The god Ashur, patron deity of the city, was originally a local mountain spirit. As Assyrian power grew, so did their god's importance. Ashur became not just a city deity, but a national god who demanded conquest and expansion. Religious duty and imperial ambition merged into a single driving force that would reshape the ancient world. Geography shaped Assyrian character in crucial ways. Unlike the flat river valleys of the south, northern Mesopotamia was hilly and broken by rivers and streams. This terrain bred hardy people accustomed to hard work and difficult conditions. It also taught them the military value of high ground and defensive positions. The Assyrians learned warfare from necessity rather than choice. Their northern location exposed them to constant raids by mountain tribes seeking plunder in the civilized lands below. These early conflicts taught valuable lessons about mobility, logistics, and the psychology of fear. The Assyrians became students of violence. Their early kings were warrior merchants who led trading expeditions that doubled as military campaigns. If negotiations failed to open new markets, force would succeed where diplomacy had not. This practical approach to problem solving would become a hallmark of Assyrian policy for centuries to come. The rise of the Mitanni kingdom to the west forced the Assyrians to choose between submission and resistance. They chose to fight, learning bitter lessons about the cost of independence. For over a century, Assyria paid tribute to foreign masters while nursing dreams of revenge. These years of humiliation forged iron determination that would not be broken. Assyrian society developed along military lines even during peacetime. Boys trained with weapons from early childhood. Men were expected to serve in the army when called upon. Women ran households and businesses while their husbands campaigned in distant lands. The entire culture was organized around the needs of warfare. The capital city of Assur reflected these priorities. Unlike the pleasure palaces of Babylon, Assyrian architecture emphasized strength over beauty. Walls were thick and high. Gates were heavily fortified. Even temples looked more like fortresses than places of worship. Every building proclaimed that this was a city ready for war. Religion in Assyria was a martial affair. Gods were warriors who demanded victory from their followers. Prayer was often combined with weapon training. Priests blessed armies before they marched to battle. Religious festivals celebrated military conquests rather than agricultural abundance. The Assyrian language, a dialect of Akkadian, gradually absorbed vocabulary from many different sources. Words for weapons, tactics, and military organization came from various conquered peoples. This linguistic flexibility reflected the Assyrian willingness to learn from anyone who could teach them something useful about warfare. Economic life in early Assyria was closely tied to military success. Successful campaigns brought in tribute and plunder that funded the next war. Trading expeditions were protected by soldiers who could also serve as raiders if opportunities arose. Commerce and conquest were partners in building national wealth. Assyrian law emphasized discipline and obedience. Punishments were severe, especially for crimes that weakened military effectiveness. Desertion from the army was punishable by death. Failure to provide military service when required resulted in heavy fines or enslavement. The legal system served the needs of the military state. Technology played a crucial role in Assyrian development. They were among the first to make extensive use of iron weapons, which were superior to bronze in both hardness and availability. They developed improved siege engines, better armor, and more effective archery techniques. Innovation was driven by military necessity. The Assyrians were also pioneers in military engineering. They built roads that allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies. They constructed fortified camps at strategic locations. They developed signaling systems using fire and smoke that could communicate across vast distances. Every technical advance served military purposes. Administrative skills learned in managing far-flung trading networks proved invaluable when governing conquered territories. The Assyrians understood the importance of accurate records, efficient communication, and reliable chain of command. They applied business principles to the business of empire with devastating effectiveness. By 1365 BCE, when Assur-ubal-Us declared himself Great King, Assyria had completed its transformation from trading city to military power. The merchant princes had become warrior kings. The counting houses had become arsenals. The trade routes had become invasion highways. A new age of conquest was about to begin. The foundations of Assyrian greatness were built during these early centuries of struggle and adaptation. They learned that survival required strength, that strength required organization, and that organization required discipline. These lessons would serve them well in the centuries of empire that lay ahead. The transformation was complete. Ashur had grown from a minor trading post into the nucleus of what would become the ancient world's most feared military machine. The merchants had become soldiers. The soldiers would soon become masters of the known world. Assyrian expansion, brutality, and propaganda. The Assyrians did not conquer with kindness. They built their empire on fear, turning terror into an art form. Their armies swept across the ancient world like a storm, leaving behind a trail of broken cities and broken spirits. Picture the Assyrian war machine in motion. Thousands of soldiers marching in perfect lines, bronze armor gleaming in the desert sun. Behind them rolled the siege engines, massive wooden towers that could breach any wall. The sound of their approach echoed for miles. Cities surrendered before the first arrow flew. The Assyrians understood something darker than other empires. They knew that true power came not just from winning battles, but from making sure no one dared to fight them again. Their methods were brutal beyond measure. When a city resisted, they did not simply conquer it. They destroyed it completely, leaving nothing but ash and memory. Entire populations were forced from their homes, families torn apart, skilled craftsmen dragged away to work in distant lands. The Assyrians called this deportation, but it was really a form of slow death. People lost their roots, their identity, their hope. They became scattered pieces of a broken puzzle. The kings of Assyria boasted about their cruelty. They carved their victories into stone, describing in detail how they flayed enemies alive, how they built pyramids from severed heads. These were not private confessions, but public declarations. The message was clear: resist us, and this will be your fate. But the Assyrians were not just brutal. They were brilliant. They understood that fear needed to be carefully managed. They created a vast network of spies and informants. Every village, every trade route, every temple had eyes watching for signs of rebellion. Information flowed back to the capital like water flowing to the sea. Their propaganda machine was equally sophisticated. Assyrian scribes wrote epic poems about their king's victories. Artists carved reliefs showing enemies cowering before Assyrian might. These images were placed in palaces and temples across the empire, constant reminders of who held power. The Assyrians also perfected the art of psychological warfare. Before attacking a city, they would send messengers to describe in vivid detail what happened to the last city that resisted. They would display the severed heads of enemy leaders on poles. They would force captured nobles to watch their own cities burn. Their siege tactics were revolutionary. They built massive earthworks to surround cities, cutting off all escape routes. They dug tunnels under walls, filling them with combustible materials. They used battering rams the size of houses, pulled by teams of oxen. No fortification could hold against such methods. The Assyrian army was a machine of war unlike anything the world had seen. Soldiers were trained from childhood. They learned to fight in formation, to operate siege equipment, to show no mercy. Their discipline was absolute. Desertion meant death. Cowardice meant worse than death. Iron weapons gave them a technological edge. While their enemies still fought with bronze, Assyrian soldiers carried iron swords and spears. Iron arrows could pierce armor that bronze could not. Iron chariots could break formations that bronze could not shatter. The empire grew with each victory. From their homeland in northern Mesopotamia, they spread west to the Mediterranean, south to Babylon, north to the mountains of Armenia. They conquered Egypt, the land of the pharaohs. They forced tribute from kingdoms that had never known foreign rule. Yet for all their power, the Assyrians lived in constant fear. They knew that empires built on terror were fragile things. Every victory created new enemies. Every act of brutality planted seeds of future rebellion. They could never rest, never trust, never feel truly safe. The burden of maintaining such an empire was enormous. Soldiers had to be fed and equipped. Fortresses had to be built and garrisoned. Officials had to be paid and watched. The cost of fear was high, and it grew higher with each passing year. Still, for nearly 3 centuries, the Assyrian way of war dominated the ancient world. They showed that terror could be a form of government, that fear could be a tool of empire. They proved that sometimes the most brutal path was also the most effective one. But they also proved something else. They showed that empires built on fear carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. The hatred they inspired would eventually consume them. The very methods that made them great would ultimately make them vulnerable. The Assyrians created a legacy of iron and blood. They changed the rules of war, the nature of empire, the relationship between ruler and ruled. Their shadow stretched across centuries, influencing every empire that came after them. Tiglath Pileser III and the Empire of Fear. In the halls of Assyrian power, one name echoed louder than all others: Tiglath Pileser III. He was the architect of terror, the master builder of an empire that ruled through fear. When he took the throne in 745 BCE, the Assyrian realm was strong but scattered. When he died, it was an unstoppable force. Tiglath Pileser understood power in ways his predecessors had not. He saw that true dominion came not from ruling subjects, but from breaking them so completely that rebellion became unthinkable. His methods were surgical in their precision, devastating in their effect. The king reorganized the entire Assyrian war machine. He created professional armies that served the crown rather than local nobles. Soldiers were no longer farmers who fought between harvests. They were warriors who lived for battle, who knew no other trade. Their loyalty belonged to the king alone. He revolutionized the art of siege warfare. His engineers designed new types of battering rams, massive machines that could split stone walls like kindling. They built portable towers that could be assembled quickly, allowing archers to rain arrows down on defenders. They perfected the use of iron-tipped arrows that could pierce any armor. But Tiglath-Pileser's greatest innovation was not military. It was administrative. He created a system of government that could digest conquered territories like a vast stomach. Local rulers were removed or killed. Assyrian governors took their place. Local customs were suppressed. Assyrian law became the only law. The deportation system reached new heights of efficiency under his rule. Entire populations were moved like chess pieces across the empire. Skilled craftsmen from Damascus found themselves rebuilding cities in Assyria. Farmers from Babylon worked fields in Syria. People lost their roots, their identity, their will to resist. His campaigns read like a catalog of calculated destruction. He swept through Syria, reducing proud cities to rubble. He conquered Israel, scattering its people to the winds. He marched into Babylon, forcing its ancient kings to bow before his throne. Each victory was total, each defeat absolute. The king's court became a theater of power. Foreign ambassadors were forced to prostrate themselves before his throne. Tribute from dozens of kingdoms flowed into his treasury. Gold from Egypt, silver from Anatolia, cedar from Lebanon. The wealth of the known world passed through his hands. Tiglath-Pileser's intelligence network was perhaps his greatest achievement. Spies reported from every corner of the empire. Merchants carried messages along with their goods. Priests whispered secrets in temple corridors. Nothing happened in his realm without his knowledge. He understood that fear required constant maintenance. A rebellion crushed in one province sent a message to all others. An act of mercy shown to one enemy encouraged others to resist. The king calibrated his cruelty like a master craftsman adjusting his tools. His building projects were monuments to Assyrian power. Palaces rose from the earth like stone mountains. Their walls were covered with reliefs showing the king's victories. Captured enemies knelt in eternal submission. Lions fell before his spear. Gods blessed his reign. The administrative reforms he implemented outlasted his dynasty. He divided the empire into provinces, each governed by appointed officials. He created a postal system that could carry messages from one end of the realm to the other. He established a census system that counted every person, every animal, every grain of wheat. Trade flourished under his iron rule. Caravans moved safely along roads protected by Assyrian garrisons. Pirates were hunted down and crucified. Bandits were impaled on stakes along major routes. Commerce thrived in the shadow of the sword. Yet the king lived in constant vigilance. He trusted no one completely, not even his own family. His palace was a fortress within a fortress. His food was tasted by servants. His sleep was guarded by loyal soldiers. Power was his burden as much as his privilege. The provinces paid tribute not just in goods, but in people. Young men were conscripted into the army. Skilled workers were relocated to Assyrian cities. Beautiful women were taken for royal harems. The empire fed on the lives of its subjects. Tiglath-Pileser's death in 727 BCE marked the end of an era, but his system lived on. He had created a template for empire that would influence rulers for centuries. His methods were copied by Persians, Greeks, Romans. The machinery of terror he built proved remarkably durable. His legacy was written in blood and stone. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years lay in ruins because of his ambition. Peoples that had sung their own songs learned to sing Assyrian hymns. The map of the ancient world was redrawn by his conquests. Under his rule, the Assyrian Empire reached a new level of efficiency and terror. It became a machine that could consume entire civilizations and leave nothing but dust. It was the first truly modern empire, built on bureaucracy, propaganda, and the systematic use of fear. Sargon II and the Assyrian apex. The throne of Assyria had never held a man quite like Sargon II. When he seized power in 722 BCE, the empire was already mighty. When he died 20 years later, it had become the greatest force the world had ever seen. His reign marked the peak of Assyrian power, a time when their armies seemed unstoppable and their reach extended to the ends of the earth. Sargon came to power through violence, as Assyrian kings often did. He was not the rightful heir, but right meant little in a world ruled by strength. He took the throne from his predecessor and made it his own through sheer force of will. The name he chose was no accident. Sargon meant true king in the old tongue, and he intended to live up to it. His first challenge came from Babylon, that ancient rival that had haunted Assyrian dreams for centuries. The Babylonian king Marduk-apla-iddina had declared independence, backed by the distant kingdom of Elam. Sargon could not allow such defiance. He marched south with an army that darkened the sky with dust. The battle for Babylon was brutal but brief. Sargon's iron discipline met Babylonian desperation, and discipline won. The city fell after a siege that lasted only days. Marduk-apla-iddina fled to the marshes, but Sargon's message was clear. There would be no safe haven for those who defied Assyria. But Sargon's greatest triumph came in the west, against the kingdom of Urartu. These mountain people had resisted Assyrian expansion for generations. Their fortresses sat like eagles' nests on impossible peaks. Their warriors fought with the fury of cornered animals. Yet Sargon broke them utterly. The campaign against Urartu was a masterpiece of military planning. Sargon's engineers built roads through mountain passes. His supply trains carried provisions across impossible terrain. His soldiers fought at altitudes where the air was thin and the cold could kill. When Urartu finally fell, the victory echoed across the ancient world. The king's building projects rivaled those of the pharaohs. He constructed a new capital city, Dur-Sharrukin, which meant Sargon's fortress. It was a marvel of planning and engineering. Straight streets led to a central palace complex. Massive walls protected the city from any conceivable attack. Gardens bloomed in the desert, fed by water carried from distant mountains. The palace at Dur-Sharrukin was a wonder of the ancient world. Its halls could hold thousands of courtiers. Its walls were covered with reliefs showing Sargon's victories. Lions and bulls stood guard at every entrance. The throne room was a cavern of polished stone where the king held court like a god among mortals. Sargon's military innovations changed the nature of ancient warfare. He perfected the use of cavalry, turning horsemen into a weapon of terror. His archers could hit targets at distances that seemed impossible. His siege engines could breach walls that had stood for centuries. No enemy could match his technological advantage. The empire's wealth during Sargon's reign was beyond measure. Tribute flowed from every corner of the known world. Egyptian gold, Phoenician purple, Anatolian silver. The royal treasury could have bought entire kingdoms. The king's personal wealth exceeded that of most gods. Trade routes stretched from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. Assyrian merchants carried goods along roads protected by Assyrian soldiers. Pirates were hunted down and executed. Bandits were impaled on stakes. Commerce thrived under the protection of the sword. Yet for all his power, Sargon lived with constant anxiety. The empire was vast but fragile. Rebellions could spark anywhere at any time. The king's spies reported daily on the mood of distant provinces. Every palace had its dungeons, every city its executions, every victory its price in blood. The king's court was a place of deadly beauty. Nobles competed for his favor with gifts and flattery. Foreign ambassadors brought tribute and trembled before his throne. Scribes recorded his every word. Artists immortalized his every victory. The machinery of power hummed with quiet efficiency. Sargon's death in 705 BCE came suddenly and mysteriously. He died during a campaign in Anatolia, far from home. Some said he fell in battle. Others whispered of poison or conspiracy. The truth died with him, but his legacy lived on. His son Sennacherib inherited an empire at its peak. The Assyrian war machine was perfectly tuned. The administrative system functioned like clockwork. The tribute system generated enormous wealth. The terror system kept enemies paralyzed with fear. But Sargon had also bequeathed his heir a terrible burden. The empire was too large to govern effectively. Too many enemies waited for signs of weakness. Too many provinces chafed under Assyrian rule. The very success of his reign had created the conditions for future disaster. The apex of Assyrian power under Sargon II would never be reached again. His reign represented the high watermark of the empire's expansion and influence. After him, the empire would endure for another century, but it would never again seem quite so invincible. The fall of Nineveh. The Assyrian collapse. The great city of Nineveh had ruled the world for 3 centuries. Its walls rose like mountains from the plain. Its palaces held the tribute of 100 nations. Its armies had never known defeat on their home ground. Yet in the summer of 612 BCE, those same walls crumbled to dust. The greatest empire the world had ever seen died in a single season. The end began with rebellion in Babylon. Nabopolassar, a Chaldean chieftain, had declared independence from Assyrian rule. This was nothing new. Babylon had rebelled before, always to be crushed and dragged back into the imperial fold. But this time was different. This time, Babylon had found an ally. Far to the east, the Medes had been watching and waiting. Their king, Cyaxares, had unified the scattered tribes of the Iranian plateau. His armies were fresh, his warriors hungry for glory. When Nabopolassar sent messengers seeking alliance, Cyaxares listened with interest. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal had died in 627 BCE, leaving behind a succession crisis. His sons fought for the throne while the empire watched. Civil war weakened the very foundations of Assyrian power. Provinces that had trembled at the mention of Assyrian might begin to test their chains. The alliance between Babylon and Media was sealed in blood and gold. Cyaxares' daughter married Nabopolassar's son, uniting the 2 royal houses. Their combined armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Assyrians suddenly found themselves facing enemies on multiple fronts. The Scythians joined the coalition, drawn by the promise of plunder. These nomadic warriors from the steppes brought a mobility that the Assyrians could not match. They struck like lightning, then vanished into the vast grasslands. The Assyrian army, built for siege warfare, struggled against such tactics. The first major victory came at Ashur, the ancient heart of Assyrian power. The city had stood for over 1,000 years. Its temples housed the gods of empire. Its streets had seen the triumph of dozens of kings. Yet when the allied armies arrived, the city fell in days. The temples were burned, the gods carried away as trophies. The psychological impact was devastating. Ashur was more than a city. It was a symbol. Its fall told the world that the Assyrians could be beaten, that their empire was not eternal. Rebellions sparked across the realm like fires in dry grass. The machinery of terror began to collapse. The Assyrian army was still formidable, but it was spread too thin. Garrisons in distant provinces were recalled to defend the heartland. This only encouraged more rebellions. The empire that had ruled through fear now found that fear working against it. The siege of Nineveh began in the spring of 612 BCE. The allied armies surrounded the city like a tightening noose. The Assyrians had built their capital to withstand any assault. The walls were 60 feet high and thick enough for chariots to race along the top. The Tigris River protected one side, while a complex system of canals and ditches guarded the others. But the allies had learned from centuries of Assyrian warfare. They brought the same siege engines that had broken so many other cities. They built earthworks to match the height of the walls. They diverted the river, turning Nineveh's protection into a weapon against it. The siege lasted 3 months. Inside the city, food ran short. Disease spread through the crowded streets. The Assyrian king, Sin-Shar-ishkun, organized the defense with desperate courage, but courage alone could not save an empire whose time had come. The end came suddenly. The river, swollen by spring rains and diverted by enemy engineers, burst through the weakened walls. Water poured into the city like a destroying flood. In the chaos, the allied armies poured in behind it. The sack of Nineveh was total. The palace libraries, containing the wisdom of centuries, were scattered to the winds. The royal treasury, filled with the tribute of the world, was divided among the victors. The great temples built to honor Assyrian gods were torn down stone by stone. The Assyrian royal family fought to the end. Sin-Sharishkan died defending his palace, sword in hand. His officers chose death over surrender. The dynasty that had ruled an empire died with the city that had been its heart. The destruction was so complete that later generations would wonder if Nineveh had ever existed at all. The Greek historian Xenophon passed by the site less than 2 centuries later and saw only mysterious mounds. The city that had terrified the world had become a legend, a memory, a tale told to children. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. In 650 BCE, Assyria had been the undisputed master of the ancient world. By 609 BCE, it had ceased to exist. The empire that had ruled through terror died in terror, consumed by the very forces it had created. The fall of Nineveh sent shockwaves across the ancient world. If the Assyrians could be defeated, if their empire could simply vanish, then perhaps no power was truly permanent. The lesson was not lost on future conquerors. Empires built on fear alone carried within them the seeds of their own destruction. The Assyrian collapse created a power vacuum that would reshape the ancient world. Babylon rose to fill the void, but it was a different kind of empire. The Medes established their own realm in the Iranian highlands. The ancient balance of power was shattered, and from its fragments, new empires would eventually emerge. The rise of Neo-Babylon, Nabopolassar and revenge. From the ashes of Assyrian tyranny, a phoenix rose. Babylon, the ancient city that had bowed to foreign masters for centuries, lifted its head once more. The man who led this resurrection was Nabopolassar, a Chaldean chieftain who would become the founder of the greatest Babylonian dynasty in history. The Chaldeans were a Semitic people who had settled in southern Mesopotamia generations earlier. They lived in the marshy lands near the Persian Gulf, a region that had always been hard to control. While Assyrian armies dominated the great cities, the Chaldeans maintained their independence in the wetlands and waterways. Nabopolassar was no ordinary tribal leader. He possessed a vision that stretched far beyond his marshy homeland. He dreamed of a restored Babylon, a city that would once again be the center of the world. But dreams alone could not topple empires. He needed allies, and he found them in the most unlikely places. The Medes had suffered under Assyrian rule just as the Babylonians had. Their king, Cyaxares, commanded armies that rivaled those of the Assyrians in size and exceeded them in motivation. When Nabopolassar sent messengers to the Median court, he offered not just alliance, but kinship. The marriage of their children would seal the bond between their peoples. The first victory came at Babylon itself. In 626 BCE, Nabopolassar led his forces into the ancient city. The Assyrian garrison was overwhelmed, but more importantly, the people welcomed him as a liberator. After centuries of foreign rule, Babylon was once again ruled by one of its own. The Assyrians responded with characteristic brutality. They sent army after army to reclaim their prize. The walls of Babylon shook under the impact of siege engines. The streets ran red with blood, yet the city held. The spirit of resistance, long suppressed, had finally found its voice. Nabopolassar proved to be a master of both war and diplomacy. He knew that Babylon alone could not defeat the Assyrian Empire. He needed to build a coalition of all those who had suffered under Assyrian rule. His messengers traveled to every corner of the known world, carrying promises of freedom and revenge. The Scythians answered his call. These nomadic warriors from the steppes brought a mobility that the Assyrians could not match. They struck at supply lines, harassed retreating armies, and vanished into the vast grasslands when pursuit came. Their horse archers were a nightmare for infantry trained to fight in formation. The Elamites joined the alliance, driven by ancient grudges against Assyrian rule. Their mountain strongholds had resisted Assyrian expansion for generations. Now they saw a chance to strike back at their oppressors. Their warriors knew every path through the Zagros Mountains, every hidden valley where armies could hide. Nabopolassar's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He would not meet the Assyrians in open battle where their superior organization might prevail. Instead, he would strike at the foundations of their power. He would liberate the cities that fed their armies, cut the trade routes that filled their treasuries, and inspire the peoples who had been forced to serve them. The campaign that followed was more than a war, it was a revolution. City after city opened its gates to the Babylonian liberator. Peoples who had been scattered by Assyrian deportation policies began to return to their ancestral homes. The empire that had ruled through fear found that fear could work both ways. The siege of Ashur in 614 BCE marked the beginning of the end. The ancient capital of Assyria, the city where their empire had been born, fell to the allied armies. The temples that had housed the gods of empire were torn down. The palaces that had sheltered kings were reduced to rubble. The symbolic heart of Assyrian power was ripped out. But Nabopolassar's greatest triumph was yet to come. In 612 BCE, his armies joined with those of Cyaxares to lay siege to Nineveh itself. The great city, symbol of Assyrian might, was surrounded by enemies who remembered every cruelty, every humiliation, every act of terror that had been committed in its name. The fall of Nineveh was complete and terrible. The city that had ruled the world was destroyed so thoroughly that later generations would wonder if it had ever existed. The royal palace, filled with the tribute of 100 nations, was looted and burned. The great library, containing the wisdom of centuries, was scattered to the winds. Nabopolassar's revenge was not just military but cultural. He sought to erase every trace of Assyrian domination. Assyrian statues were pulled down and smashed. Assyrian inscriptions were chiseled away. The very language of the empire was suppressed in favor of Aramaic and Babylonian. The restoration of Babylon began immediately. Nabopolassar poured the wealth of the conquered empire into rebuilding his capital. The great temples, neglected under Assyrian rule, were restored to their former glory. The walls of the city, damaged by centuries of siege, were rebuilt stronger than ever. But perhaps Nabopolassar's greatest achievement was the creation of a new kind of empire. Unlike the Assyrians, who had ruled through terror, the Babylonians would rule through prosperity. Trade was encouraged, not plundered. Local customs were respected, not suppressed. The empire became a partnership rather than a prison. The Chaldean dynasty that Nabopolassar founded would rule Babylon for nearly a century. His son Nebuchadnezzar would make the city the wonder of the ancient world. His successors would continue the work of restoration and expansion. The Neo-Babylonian Empire would become the last great Mesopotamian power. Yet even as he celebrated his victories, Nabopolassar knew that empires were fragile things. He had destroyed the Assyrians, but he had also created a power vacuum. Other ambitious kings would seek to fill it. The cycle of conquest and liberation would continue as it always had in the land between the rivers. Nebuchadnezzar II and the Hanging Gardens. In all the annals of ancient history, few names shine as brightly as Nebuchadnezzar II. He was the king who made Babylon into a wonder of the world, who built gardens that seemed to float in the air, who created monuments that would inspire awe for centuries to come. His reign, from 605 to 562 BCE, marked the golden age of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar inherited a kingdom already great, but he would make it greater still. His father Nabopolassar had liberated Babylon from Assyrian rule and established the Chaldean dynasty. Now it fell to the son to fulfill the promise of that liberation. He would not disappoint. The young king's first challenge came from Egypt. The pharaoh Necho II had marched north to claim the former Assyrian territories for himself. At the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar met the Egyptian army in a clash that would decide the fate of the ancient world. The Babylonian victory was total, driving the Egyptians back to their own borders. With Egypt neutralized, Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention to the small kingdoms of the Levant. These buffer states had played a dangerous game, switching sides between Egypt and Babylon as it suited them. The king decided to end this uncertainty once and for all. One by one, he brought them under Babylonian control. The kingdom of Judah proved particularly troublesome. Its kings repeatedly rebelled against Babylonian rule, encouraged by false promises of Egyptian support. Nebuchadnezzar's patience finally ran out in 597 BCE. He marched on Jerusalem, captured the city, and carried away its leading citizens. But the lesson was not learned. When Judah rebelled again in 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar's response was swift and terrible. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 18 months. The city was starved into submission, its walls breached, its temple destroyed. The surviving population was carried away into exile in Babylon. The kingdom of Judah ceased to exist. Yet Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a conqueror. He was also a builder on a scale that rivaled the pharaohs. His vision for Babylon was nothing less than to make it the most beautiful city in the world. He would succeed beyond his wildest dreams. The Ishtar Gate became the wonder of the ancient world. Its walls were covered with glazed bricks and decorated with golden dragons and bulls. The gate rose 60 feet into the air, its towers reaching toward heaven. Visitors approaching Babylon would see this marvel from miles away, a symbol of the city's power and beauty. The processional way that led to the Ishtar Gate was equally magnificent. Its walls were lined with glazed bricks showing striding lions, the symbol of the goddess Ishtar. The street itself was paved with limestone and red breccia, polished to a mirror shine. During religious festivals, the procession of gods would move down this sacred way like a river of gold and silver. But perhaps Nebuchadnezzar's greatest achievement was the creation of the Hanging Gardens. These terraced gardens rose in steps from the banks of the Euphrates, each level supported by massive stone arches. Water was lifted from the river by an ingenious system of pumps and chains, creating streams and fountains that flowed down through the gardens. The gardens were planted with trees and flowers from every corner of the empire. Cedar trees from Lebanon grew beside date palms from the south. Roses from Persia bloomed next to jasmine from India. The air was filled with the scent of 1,000 different flowers. Birds of every description made their homes in this artificial paradise. Legend says that Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens for his wife, Amytis of Media. She had grown up in the green hills of her homeland and pined for the gardens of her youth. The king, moved by her homesickness, created for her a mountain of green in the heart of the desert. Whether true or not, the story captures something essential about the man and his age. The palace complex that Nebuchadnezzar built was a city within a city. Its throne room was a vast hall that could hold thousands of courtiers. The walls were covered with glazed bricks showing scenes of the king's victories. The ceiling was supported by columns of cedar and cypress, their capitals carved with flowers and fruits. The king's private apartments were equally magnificent. His bedroom was paved with lapis lazuli and gold. His bath was carved from a single block of alabaster. His private garden was filled with rare flowers and exotic animals. Lions and leopards walked on golden chains. Peacocks strutted across manicured lawns. But Nebuchadnezzar's building projects were not limited to his own comfort. He rebuilt the great temple of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. The ziggurat rose in 7 terraced levels, each painted a different color. At its summit stood a golden statue of the god, visible for miles across the flat plain. The city walls that Nebuchadnezzar built were massive beyond belief. They stretched for miles around the city, thick enough for chariots to race along their tops. Guard towers rose at regular intervals, each one a fortress in itself. The walls were said to be so strong that they could withstand any siege. The king's achievements were not merely architectural. Under his rule, Babylon became the center of learning and culture. Scholars came from across the known world to study in its libraries. Astronomers made observations that would influence science for centuries. Mathematicians developed new systems of calculation. The city hummed with intellectual activity. Trade flourished under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. Caravans from India brought spices and precious stones. Ships from the Mediterranean carried purple dye and cedar wood. The markets of Babylon sold goods from every corner of the known world. The king's treasury overflowed with the wealth of the earth. Yet for all his achievements, Nebuchadnezzar was a man haunted by dreams and visions. The biblical account tells of his madness, of years spent living like a wild beast. Whether literal or metaphorical, the story suggests a man overwhelmed by the burden of his own success. The king died in 562 BCE, leaving behind an empire at its peak. But he also left behind a problem that would prove fatal. The Babylonian Empire had become too dependent on the genius of one man. When that man was gone, the empire would begin its slow slide toward destruction. Babylonian captivity. Clash with the Israelites. The clash between Babylon and the small kingdom of Judah was more than a military campaign. It was a meeting of two worlds, two ways of understanding the divine, two visions of how humanity should live. The consequences would echo through history, shaping the faith of millions and the culture of the West. The kingdom of Judah was tiny compared to the great empires of Mesopotamia. It controlled only a small strip of hill country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. Its capital, Jerusalem, was a modest city built around a single temple. Yet this small kingdom possessed something that the great empires lacked, a revolutionary idea about God. The Israelites believed in one God, a deity who was not bound to any particular place or people, but who ruled over all creation. This God demanded justice, not just ritual. He cared about the poor and the oppressed. He could not be bought with sacrifices or appeased with offerings. This was a radical departure from the polytheistic religions of the ancient world. The Babylonians, by contrast, worshipped many gods. Each city had its patron deity. Each profession had its protecting spirit. The king was the god's representative on earth, ruling by divine right. The temples were the gods' houses, where they lived and ate and received the worship of their people. When these two worlds collided, the result was inevitable. The Babylonians saw the Israelites as stubborn rebels who refused to acknowledge the supremacy of Babylonian gods. The Israelites saw the Babylonians as idolaters who worshipped false gods made of wood and stone. The first deportation came in 597 BCE. King Jehoiakim of Judah had rebelled against Babylonian rule. Nebuchadnezzar's response was swift and decisive. He besieged Jerusalem, captured the young king, and carried him away to Babylon along with 10,000 of his subjects. The cream of Judean society was transplanted to Mesopotamia, but the lesson was not learned. The puppet king left behind in Jerusalem, Zedekiah, was persuaded by his advisors to rebel again. They believed that Egypt would come to their aid, that the Babylonians were too distant to respond effectively. They were wrong on both counts. The second siege of Jerusalem began in 588 BCE. This time, Nebuchadnezzar was determined to end the problem once and for all. The siege lasted 18 months. The city was surrounded by a wall of earth and stone that made escape impossible. Food ran out. Disease spread through the crowded streets. Desperation consumed the inhabitants. When the walls were finally breached in 586 BCE, the end came swiftly. King Zedekiah tried to flee but was captured near Jericho. He was forced to watch as his sons were executed before his eyes. Then his own eyes were put out, and he was carried away to Babylon in chains. The Temple of Solomon, the pride of the Jewish people, was stripped of its treasures and burned to the ground. The deportation that followed was systematic and thorough. The Babylonians had learned from experience that leaving a population in place only led to future rebellions. They carried away everyone who might provide leadership. Priests, nobles, craftsmen, scribes. Only the poorest of the poor were left behind to tend the vineyards and work the fields. The journey to Babylon was a trail of tears that stretched for hundreds of miles. Families were separated. The elderly and infirm died along the way. Children were born in exile, knowing no homeland but the road. The survivors who finally reached Mesopotamia were broken in body and spirit. Yet exile would prove to be not just destruction, but transformation. The Jews in Babylon faced a crisis that would reshape their entire faith. How could they worship their God in a foreign land? How could they maintain their identity without their temple, their sacrifices, their homeland? The answer came through innovation and adaptation. Synagogues replaced the temple as centers of worship. Prayer replaced sacrifice as the primary religious act. The study of Scripture became more important than priestly ritual. Judaism was reinvented for survival in diaspora. The scribes and scholars in exile began the monumental task of collecting and preserving their religious traditions. Stories that had been passed down orally for generations were written down. Laws that had governed the kingdom were codified. Prophecies of return and restoration were recorded for future generations. The Babylonians, for their part, were remarkably tolerant of their Jewish exiles. Unlike the Assyrians, who had tried to eliminate the identity of conquered peoples, the Babylonians allowed the Jews to maintain their customs and worship their God. They were settled in communities along the canals near Babylon, where they could farm and trade. Some Jews prospered in exile. The biblical figure of Daniel rose to high position in the Babylonian court. Jewish merchants established trading networks that stretched across the empire. Jewish scholars studied in Babylonian schools, learning mathematics and astronomy that would enrich their own traditions. But prosperity could not heal the wound of exile. The Psalms composed during this period speak of weeping by the rivers of Babylon, of hanging up harps on the willow trees. The longing for Jerusalem became a defining characteristic of Jewish consciousness. The prophets of the exile spoke words of both judgment and hope. They explained the destruction of Jerusalem as divine punishment for the people's sins, but they also promised restoration, a return to the promised land, a new covenant between God and his people. These prophecies would sustain Jewish hope through centuries of dispersion. The Babylonian exile lasted nearly 70 years. During that time, an entire generation grew up knowing only life in Mesopotamia. Yet they maintained their distinct identity, their unique faith, their dream of return. When the opportunity finally came, many would choose to remain in Babylon, but their cousins would rebuild Jerusalem. The impact of the exile on Jewish thought was profound and lasting. The experience of powerlessness led to new understandings of divine justice. The encounter with Babylonian culture enriched Jewish learning. The challenge of maintaining faith in foreign circumstances strengthened Jewish resolve. For the Babylonians, the Jewish exile was just one episode in a long history of conquest and deportation. They could not have imagined that these displaced people would survive as a distinct community for thousands of years, or that their scriptures would become the foundation of Western civilization. The books written during the Babylonian captivity would outlast the empire that created them. The Temple of Solomon was destroyed, but its memory was preserved in writing. The kingdom of Judah vanished from the map, but its legacy lived on in the hearts of its scattered children. When the exile finally ended, the Jews who returned to Jerusalem brought with them new institutions, new practices, new understandings of their faith. They rebuilt the temple, but it was a different temple for a different people. The Babylonian captivity had ended, but its influence would endure forever. The Persian conquest. Cyrus the Great arrives. The empire of Babylon seemed eternal in its golden splendor. Its walls rose like mountains from the plain. Its gardens bloomed in impossible beauty. Its treasuries overflowed with the wealth of the known world. Yet in the autumn of 539 BCE, all of this glory crumbled before a single man from the distant highlands of Persia. Cyrus II, called the Great, was unlike any conqueror the world had seen. He came not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. His armies moved across the landscape like a gentle wind rather than a destroying storm. Cities opened their gates to welcome him. Peoples who had groaned under Babylonian rule hailed him as their savior. The Persian homeland lay in the rugged mountains of the Iranian plateau. For centuries, the Persians had lived as vassals of the Medes, a related people who controlled much of the highland region. But Cyrus was no ordinary vassal. He possessed a vision that stretched far beyond the mountain valleys of his birth. In 550 BCE, Cyrus had overthrown his Median overlord and united the Persian tribes under his rule. The Median Empire, which had helped destroy Assyria, now fell to its former subjects. But Cyrus treated the conquered Medes with remarkable clemency. He allowed them to keep their customs, their religion, their local rulers. This policy of tolerance would become the hallmark of Persian rule. The conquest of Lydia followed in 546 BCE. King Croesus, whose wealth was legendary throughout the ancient world, had underestimated the young Persian king. The fall of Sardis, Croesus's capital, sent shockwaves across the ancient world. If the richest king on earth could be defeated, no throne was safe. But it was Cyrus's treatment of the conquered that truly set him apart. Where other conquerors had ruled through fear, he ruled through respect. Local customs were preserved. Local religions were protected. Local rulers were allowed to govern under Persian oversight. The empire became a mosaic of peoples rather than a single homogeneous mass. The advance toward Babylon was methodical and irresistible. City after city submitted without a fight. The Persian propaganda machine was as effective as any army. Cyrus portrayed himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler chosen by the gods themselves. Even Babylonian priests began to see him as their salvation. The last king of Babylon, Nabonidus, had alienated his own people through religious innovations that offended traditional sensibilities. He had neglected the great god Marduk in favor of the moon god Sin. He had moved the capital from Babylon to the distant oasis of Tema. The priests and people of Babylon felt abandoned by their own king. When Cyrus finally approached Babylon in 539 BCE, the city fell without a siege. The Persian king marched through the Ishtar Gate not as a conqueror but as a welcomed guest. The Babylonian chronicle records that he was greeted with green branches and joy. The people saw him as their liberator from an unpopular king. Cyrus's first act was to restore the neglected worship of Marduk. He presented himself as the chosen of the Babylonian god, ruling by divine mandate rather than force of arms. The famous Cyrus cylinder, inscribed in Akkadian, proclaimed his respect for Babylonian traditions and his intention to rule justly. But perhaps Cyrus's most famous act was the liberation of the Jewish exiles. The decree allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple was unprecedented in ancient history. No conqueror had ever voluntarily released valuable deportees. Yet Cyrus saw this act not as weakness, but as wisdom. The return of the Jews was part of a broader policy of religious tolerance. Throughout his empire, Cyrus restored temples that had been neglected or destroyed. He returned sacred statues to their original homes. He allowed priests to resume their traditional ceremonies. The empire became a haven for religious diversity. This tolerance was not merely idealistic, it was practical. Religious persecution had been a constant source of rebellion in previous empires. By allowing people to worship as they chose, Cyrus removed a major cause of unrest. His empire was held together not by fear, but by gratitude. The administrative system that Cyrus established was equally innovative. The empire was divided into satrapies, or provinces, each governed by a satrap appointed by the king. But these governors ruled through existing local structures rather than imposing a foreign bureaucracy. The system was flexible enough to accommodate the diverse peoples of the empire. The Persian royal road system connected the far-flung provinces of the empire. Messages could travel from one end of the realm to the other in a matter of weeks rather than months. Trade flourished under the protection of Persian arms. The empire became the largest and most prosperous the world had ever seen. Yet Cyrus never forgot his Persian roots. The capital remained at Pasargadae in the Persian heartland. Persian nobles held the highest positions in the government. The Persian language became the lingua franca of the empire. Persian customs influenced court life throughout the realm. The death of Cyrus in 530 BCE during a campaign against nomadic tribes in Central Asia marked the end of an era. But the empire he had founded would endure for more than 2 centuries. His successors would expand it even further, reaching from India to Greece, from the Black Sea to the Sahara. The Persian conquest of Babylon was more than a change of rulers. It represented a new model of empire, one based on tolerance rather than terror, on cooperation rather than coercion. The methods that Cyrus pioneered would influence imperial practice for centuries to come. For Mesopotamia, the Persian conquest marked the end of its independence. Never again would the land between the rivers be ruled by its own people. Yet Persian rule was so light that many welcomed it. The oppressive weight of Assyrian and Babylonian imperialism was finally lifted. The Persian Empire would prove more durable than its predecessors because it was built on different foundations. Where others had ruled through force, Cyrus ruled through consent. Where others had suppressed local traditions, he embraced them. Where others had created empires of fear, he created an empire of hope. The long echo, Mesopotamia, under foreign rule. The land between the rivers would never again know native rule. After Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, Mesopotamia became a province in someone else's empire. Yet the region that had given birth to civilization continued to matter. Its cities remained important, its people adapted and endured. Its influence echoed across centuries. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamia enjoyed a golden autumn. The Achaemenid kings treated the ancient region with respect. Babylon remained one of the empire's most important cities. Its priests continued their ancient rituals. Its merchants traded across the known world. The ziggurat of Marduk still rose toward heaven, though foreign kings now paid for its upkeep. The Persian period brought peace and prosperity to the war-weary region. No longer did armies march across the plain every few years. No longer did cities burn in the night. The Pax Persica, the Persian peace, settled over Mesopotamia like a gentle rain after drought. Local customs were not merely tolerated but encouraged. The Babylonian calendar continued to govern religious festivals. The ancient law codes still regulated daily life. Cuneiform scribes still recorded contracts and correspondence. The Persian genius lay in ruling through existing structures rather than destroying them. Yet change was inevitable. Aramaic gradually replaced Akkadian as the common language of administration and trade. Greek merchants began to appear in the markets of Babylon. New ideas flowed along the trade routes that connected Mesopotamia to India and Egypt. The ancient isolation was broken forever. The conquest of Alexander the Great in 331 BCE brought dramatic change. The young Macedonian king entered Babylon in triumph, but he came as an admirer rather than a destroyer. He ordered the rebuilding of the ziggurat of Marduk. He adopted Persian court customs. He planned to make Babylon the capital of his world empire. Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BCE ended that dream. The city where he died became the symbol of his empire's fragility. His generals divided his conquests among themselves, and Mesopotamia fell to Seleucus, one of his most capable commanders. The Seleucid Empire brought Greek culture to Mesopotamia on an unprecedented scale. Greek cities were founded throughout the region. Greek schools taught Homer and Plato alongside Babylonian wisdom. Greek gods shared temples with ancient Mesopotamian deities. The fusion of cultures created something entirely new. Yet the old ways persisted in the countryside. Farmers still prayed to the ancient gods for good harvests. Village priests still performed rituals that stretched back to Sumerian times. The cuneiform script survived in temple schools long after Greek became the language of government and learning. The Parthians conquered Mesopotamia in the 2nd century BCE, bringing Iranian culture back to the region. They ruled for nearly 4 centuries, longer than any empire since the Assyrians. Under Parthian rule, Mesopotamia became a crossroads between East and West, a meeting place of civilizations. Trade flourished under the Parthians. Silk from China passed through Mesopotamian markets on its way to Rome. Spices from India were sold in the bazaars of Ctesiphon. The region's location made it wealthy even as it remained politically dependent. The Sassanid Persians replaced the Parthians in 224 CE, bringing their own vision of imperial rule. They built magnificent palaces at Ctesiphon that rivaled those of ancient Babylon. They promoted Zoroastrianism as the state religion while tolerating other faiths. They saw themselves as the heirs of Cyrus and Darius. Christianity spread through Mesopotamia during the Sassanid period. The region became home to some of the earliest Christian communities outside the Roman Empire. Syriac Christianity developed its own distinctive traditions, its own literary culture, its own theological insights. The Islamic conquest in 637 CE brought yet another transformation. The Arab armies came not just as conquerors, but as bearers of a new faith. Islam would eventually become the dominant religion of the region, though Jewish and Christian communities continued to flourish. Under Islamic rule, Mesopotamia experienced a remarkable renaissance. The Abbasid caliphs founded Baghdad near the ruins of ancient Babylon. The new city became the largest in the world, a center of learning and culture that attracted scholars from every continent. The translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries preserved and transmitted the wisdom of antiquity. Greek philosophy, Persian literature, and Indian mathematics were all translated into Arabic in the libraries of Baghdad. The intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia merged with Islamic scholarship to create new forms of knowledge. Yet even as Baghdad rose to greatness, the ancient cities declined. Babylon became a ruin, its bricks carried away to build new structures. Nineveh disappeared beneath grassy mounds. Was abandoned to the desert. The physical monuments of the first civilization crumbled, but their influence lived on. The Mongol invasion of 1258 CE devastated Mesopotamia more thoroughly than any previous conquest. Baghdad was sacked and burned. The irrigation system that had sustained the region for millennia was destroyed. The population was scattered or slaughtered. The land between the rivers became a shadow of its former self. Recovery was slow and partial. Later empires ruled Mesopotamia from distant capitals. The Ottomans made it a provincial backwater. The British turned it into a mandate. Not until the 20th century would the region again be governed by its own people. And even then, the borders drawn by foreigners divided the ancient homeland. Throughout these long centuries of foreign rule, the people of Mesopotamia preserved fragments of their ancient heritage. Traditional crafts survived in village workshops. Ancient songs were sung at weddings and festivals. Folk tales preserved memories of kings and heroes from the distant past. The archaeological rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization in the 19th century revealed the magnitude of what had been lost. Entire cities emerged from the earth. Thousands of cuneiform tablets told stories that had been silent for millennia. The world suddenly realized that human civilization was far older and more complex than anyone had imagined. Today, the land between the rivers faces new challenges. Modern borders divide the ancient homeland. Political instability threatens archaeological sites. The rising waters of new dams submerge ruins that had survived for thousands of years. Yet the legacy of Mesopotamia endures in ways both obvious and subtle. The cities we live in descend from Mesopotamian models. The laws that govern us echo Mesopotamian codes. The stories we tell ourselves about civilization begin in the land between the rivers. We are all, in some sense, children of Sumer and Babylon and Assyria, the birthplace of civilization. Here, where the Tigris and Euphrates flow toward the sea, something miraculous happened. In this flat land of mud and reeds, humanity took its first steps toward civilization. Everything we call human progress began here, in the place we now call Iraq, in the time before memory, when the world was young and full of possibility. The gift of this land was water. Not the gentle rain that falls in other places, but the violent floods that came each spring, carrying rich soil from distant mountains. The people who lived here learned to tame those floods, to channel them into canals, to make the desert bloom. That act of taming nature was the first step towards civilization. From irrigation came surplus. From surplus came specialization. No longer did everyone have to grow their own food. Some could make pottery. Others could work metal. Still others could serve the gods or keep records or make laws. Society became complex, layered, sophisticated. The first cities rose from this complexity. Ur and Uruk, Babylon and Nineveh, each one a world unto itself, protected by walls, governed by kings, blessed by gods. Within those walls, humanity learned to live together in numbers never seen before. The arts of government, law, and diplomacy were born from necessity. Writing came from the need to keep track of grain and sheep, but it became something far greater. The first scratches in clay evolved into literature, into law codes, into the preservation of human thought. When scribes learned to capture speech and symbols, they gave humanity its memory. No longer would knowledge die with the knower. The wheel turned in Mesopotamian workshops before it rolled anywhere else. Not just the potter's wheel, but the cart wheel that would carry goods across continents. The wheel that would lift water from deep wells. The wheel that would become the foundation of all future technology. Mathematics began here too, with the need to measure fields and count sheep. But it grew into something beautiful and abstract. Mesopotamian scholars divided the circle into 360 degrees. They gave us the 60-minute hour. They taught the Greeks geometry. They laid the foundations of astronomy. The gods of Mesopotamia were the first to be honored with written hymns, the first to receive temples built to mathematical precision, the first to be served by organized priesthoods. From their worship came the first laws, for justice was seen as divine. From their temples came the first schools, for priests needed to learn to read. Empire was born here too, first in Akkad, then in Babylon and Assyria. The dream of uniting all peoples under one rule, of bringing peace through power, of creating order from chaos. The methods were often brutal, but the vision was grand. Every empire since has followed the Mesopotamian template. Trade networks spread from here like spider webs across the ancient world. Merchants carried Mesopotamian goods to India and Anatolia. They brought back lapis lazuli and silver, cedar and gold. Commerce became the lifeblood of civilization, connecting distant peoples in bonds of mutual benefit. The Code of Hammurabi was carved in stone before Moses received the tablets on Mount Sinai. Justice based on written law rather than the whim of rulers. The idea that even kings must bow to principles higher than themselves, the foundation of every legal system that followed. Literature was born here in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first story to explore what it means to be human. Friendship and mortality, power and responsibility, the search for meaning in an uncertain world. Every hero's journey since has followed the path that Gilgamesh first walked. The calendar we use today began in Babylon. The 7-day week, the 12-month year, the careful observation of celestial cycles. Time itself was organized by Mesopotamian wisdom, given structure and meaning that still governs our lives. Science started here with the patient observation of the heavens. Babylonian astronomers tracked the movements of planets with precision that would not be matched for centuries. They predicted eclipses, calculated planetary positions, created the zodiac. They showed that the universe follows rules that human minds can understand. Medicine began here too, with the first systematic approach to healing. Mesopotamian physicians combined practical knowledge with spiritual wisdom. They recognized that disease had natural causes, but they also understood the power of hope and faith in healing. The legacy lives on in ways both obvious and hidden. Every time we divide an hour into minutes, we use Mesopotamian mathematics. Every time we consult a calendar, we follow Babylonian wisdom. Every time we read a story about a hero's quest, we echo Gilgamesh. Our cities are built on Mesopotamian models. Our laws descend from Mesopotamian codes. Our schools follow patterns first established in temple courtyards between the rivers. Our very idea of what civilization means was first imagined here. The land between the rivers gave humanity its first taste of what we could become. Not just hunters and gatherers scattered across the landscape, but builders of cities, writers of laws, tellers of stories, seekers of truth. The spark of human potential was first kindled here and has never been extinguished. Today, archaeologists still dig in the ancient mounds, still find tablets covered with cuneiform writing, still uncover the foundations of ziggurats and palaces. Each discovery reminds us that we are not the first to dream of greatness, not the first to build something lasting, not the first to look up at the stars and wonder. The civilizations of Mesopotamia rose and fell like waves on a shore, each one leaving its mark before being swept away by the next. Sumer gave way to Akkad, Babylon to Assyria, empire to empire in an endless cycle. Yet something essential remained, passed down from generation to generation like a sacred flame. That flame still burns in every city street, every law court, every school classroom, every library shelf. The people of Mesopotamia are long gone, their cities are ruins, their languages are dead, but their gift to humanity lives on. They showed us that we could be more than we were, that we could build something greater than ourselves, that we could leave a mark that would last forever. The land between the rivers taught us to dream of tomorrow while building for today. That lesson echoes still in every human heart that refuses to accept the world as it is and dares to imagine what it could become. We are all citizens of that first civilization, all heirs to that first great dream.